Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here in the Treehouse. Before we start our discussion of this week's entry into the Positive Masculinity playlist, I wanted to tell you to check out the show notes for the list of sources we use in this episode, as well as a list of content warnings. If you'd like to connect with us or share ideas for future episodes, find us on Instagram and Facebook at A Safe Place for Boys, or email us at safeplaceforboys@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and enjoy the show. One time I made a joke about Karens while I was teaching and realized not only did I have a student named Karen, she was sitting directly in front of me.
That's a big oof.
Yeah, that was humiliating. I'm so sorry, Karen, if you're listening.
But change your name.
No, she shouldn't have to change her name. Middle-aged white ladies should be better. Anyway, that's not the point. Okay. That's not the kind of psychobomb we're talking about. A safe place for boys, compassionate conversations about masculinity in media. I am your host, Kelcee Sykes. With me, as always, is the prince of the underworld himself, Dr. Spencer Todd Bennington, PhD. How are you, Spencer?
Chiasmus.
Oh.
Kairos.
Ooh.
Thanatopsis.
Ooh.
That's how good I am. Yeah. Hey, I got one more for you. Topoi.
Topoi.
Yeah.
Is that a Pokemon?
I'm your Topoi boy here in the treehouse.
You didn't answer my question. Is that a Pokemon?
I don't know what the next gen is. Maybe they are all like Greco-Roman mythology, weird linguistic phrase inspired. I mean, they're running out of ideas, right? They have a Pokemon that's just like keys.
Yeah, an ice cream cone.
Like a crying lizard or something. So like...
So sad. Why is he so sad?
Crocodile tears. Yeah, I mean, why don't they make one about like poetic terms of art, rhetorical terms, you know? I mean, I would play as Thanatopsis. That'd be cool.
What would Thanatopsis's type be?
It'd have to be grass plus ghost, because the whole idea of that poem is that like I remember this image of like roots like emerging through corpses, like the idea that death, you know, lends to new life kind of thing, like necrogenesis, you know. So I think it would be a grass ghost type.
We're not talking about Pokemon today.
No, but we are talking about Thanos for a little bit, I bet.
Well, we might talk
because we're reviewing the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of it.
Yeah, spoiler alert, not a lot of great stuff. Not that good. Went on for too long. Probably time to call it, boys.
Well, if it's not that Thanos, who are we? What are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about someone else in the pantheon of gods, because we are talking about the 2019 video game from a little studio called Supergiant, and it is called Hades.
Now, wait just a gosh darn second. This ain't no video game podcast.
Could have fooled me. We spent 5 minutes talking about Pokemon.
Okay, fair enough. But this seems like a deviation from our typical media analysis format. So how in the heck are we going to talk about a video game?
Well, I don't know if you knew this, but it's a lot more than just Pac-Man these days. They got video games.
Well, yeah, they have like Pong. There's the Galaga where you're in the spaceship.
Yeah, there's the screensaver where you're in the maze.
That one I've never beaten, actually. I found the smiley face a couple times, but I don't. Is that winning? Did I win?
Is that the thing that just makes the screen flip upside down?
I don't remember.
I don't remember either. But the point is, video games, like many other forms of media, have stories in them.
Sure. So let's talk about narrative or whatever.
I will talk about narrative. I am sort of a recent convert to the gamer lifestyle. What about you? Were you a lifelong gamer?
Yeah, actually, and I attribute that to the fact that I have a brother that's 7 years older, and when he was actually 6 or 7 years old, my mom's dad, our grandfather, gave him a Super Nintendo with Super Mario Brothers on it.
Wow.
And like, that's one of the earliest memories I have of playing a video game. We had that, and like, to be clear, he would very rarely let me play.
This is the plight of we were both younger siblings, so it's like, well, yeah, when our older sibling wasn't home, sometimes we could play a video game for like 40 minutes.
Well, Mario is a one-player game. So many of those games on the Nintendo were one-player. We had Duck Hunt, so like I got to sort of play that. And then I remember getting really hurt one time so badly that like my brother actually took pity on me. And so I had like a full afternoon of laying in the floor playing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle game for Nintendo. It was dope. But then like, yeah, from there, I had a Sega Genesis. And then, like, one of the greatest... I was basically that little kid on YouTube freaking out when I got my N64.
Nintendo 64!
Yeah. Like, it was crazy.
Man, I don't know where that kid is now. He's probably 45 years old. I hope you're doing well, Nintendo 64 guy.
Love that kid. I mean, he really captured the zeitgeist. I was so stoked to play Pokemon Snap, the original, where you just go around taking pictures of Pokemon on the Nintendo. In the modern gaming environment, like, as you got into games, I kind of got out of them. Because, like, they just got so big. They're so big, and I don't have the time. I got, like, 50 jobs, and one of them is not playing video games. So...
Ugh, that's a shame.
I know. I'm frequently intimidated by them. And honestly, a game like Hades is one that I don't think I would ever play to the extent that you have. Just, I lose patience with the kind of things that you love so much about this game.
We are complete opposite gamer person. I don't know if there's like a gamer personality test out there. Spencer and I are entirely different. We cannot play a game together because I want to walk around and talk to all the characters and open all the boxes, and he
wants to push them off the ledge, all of them.
He wants to grab a rat that's actually a man off the ground in the Druid Grove and get all the tieflings killed. That's what Spencer wants to do.
I didn't know he was a man. I didn't want to kill all the tieflings. I wanted to kill all the druids. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
This is not a Baldur's Gate 3 therapy session.
Yet.
It will be someday, I'm sure, but when I'm ready to talk about it. But yeah, Hades was a game that I found at, like, the perfect time. I got a Steam key as a gift from one of our former roommates as a Christmas gift in the year 2020.
Excellent gift, excellent timing.
Yes, the best gift I've ever gotten given the timing that it happened, because I was on break during grad school, and it was 2020, so I couldn't go home. I couldn't see anybody. So I just spent the entire month of December 2020 relentlessly playing the game Hades over and over and over again, which is an easy thing to do with Hades because it is a roguelike.
Yeah, I was going to say that is kind of the point.
Yeah.
To play it over and over again.
Yeah.
What's a roguelike, Kelcee?
A roguelike?
I honestly didn't know that term until you started playing Hades. I've never played games like this.
Yeah, so for any of you non-gamers, a roguelike is a video game in which you battle your way through sort of procedurally generated levels. You know, if you've ever heard the term dungeon crawl, it's sort of the same thing, where the levels just kind of spawn in, and you generally either have to fight your way through a lot of enemies or try to like solve some kind of puzzles to get to the next section. And you just try to get as far as you can, because every time that you die, you get sent back to the very beginning of the game. So there are no save points mid-level in a roguelike.
You lost me. I'm already done with this because like and when you told me that this was the nature of the game, I could not believe that this was something that you wanted to play. What of all people, like, you hate any level of difficulty in a game that prevents you from like talking to people or whatever.
Yeah.
And so like why?
But okay, so I'm going to tell you why I like Hades so much here in just a minute. But Hades is a roguelike game in which you play as a character named Zagreus, who in this version of the story, which as you can probably guess is based on Greek mythology, given that it is named after Hades. In this version of the story, Zagreus is the son of Hades, who is the Greek god of the underworld, which is where all mortal souls are sent when they die, and they kind of get sorted into these different areas of the afterlife, depending on the kind of life that they lead. So the player's goal as Zagreus is to break out of the underworld by battling your way through each of the different levels of the underworld, which is Tartarus, Asphodel, and Elysium, until you get up to the surface world. Why I like the gameplay of this game is because if there are any real gamer nerds in the audience, they're sitting there at their podcast player saying, well, it's not actually a roguelike game. It's actually something called a roguelite, Lite. Which is a distinction that only makes sense to gamers. But the reason that it is a roguelite instead of a roguelike is because there is still both story progression and character build progression every time you die. So every time Zagreus dies out in the underworld, he gets sent back to his father's house, which is called the House of Hades, and he has to start his next attempt all over again. But in his case, he gets to bring back a certain number of resources that he can use to, like, upgrade his skills and his weapons to hopefully make it further into the underworld each time. So it's not relying just on, like, a player figuring out, like, how to navigate through the game more effectively. The character himself is also getting stronger each time.
Okay.
That's part of why the gameplay is not as frustrating as it could be.
That's fair.
That being said, yeah, I still play it on easy mode because I like to have a nice time.
Well, I mean,
sue me.
And to the game's credit, it was like, hey, you're dying a lot. Do you want to play on easy mode? Because, like, we have easy mode. Like, there's more to this game than just dying a bunch and getting frustrated.
They make you feel really good about it because it's not called easy mode. It's called God mode. So you're like, oh, yes, it's because I'm a god that I'm progressing so much easier.
Hilarious. God mode, in my experience, was like what I needed the Game Shark cheat codes for to turn on in my original Diablo game so that I could spam infinite fireballs.
Like I said, it's not the old video game landscape anymore. But the other thing that sets Hades apart from other roguelike games is the richness and the number of interactions that you can have with other characters in the game, specifically back in the house. So from my perspective as a player, it's never frustrating to die out in the underworld because then you get sent back to the house, and the house is where all of my friends are. So I get to go and talk to all of my cool friends back in my dad's house. And every time you go back, you get to unravel a little bit more information about Zagreus and the other characters and get more information about why this, like, extremely handsome half-dressed man is trying to run away from home.
That was my big question. Yeah, why would anyone ever want to leave the House of Hades?
It seems so great to live in the House of Hades.
Got a dog, you got buddies, your dad's there, you're renovating the place. What what could be better?
Well, I'll tell you why. Because the reason that I wanted to bring this video game to our non-video game podcast is not because the gameplay is satisfying. It is because it's a good story. Okay. So in a very roundabout way to answer your question, that is why we were talking about this.
Okay. This is a story that we feel like is worth discussing, even if you don't play this game, because it brings something to our compassionate conversations for masculine...
You're never going to learn our tagline.
Nope.
Yes, it has interesting things today to say specifically about masculinity and a certain type of relationship between men. But to start with, if you're like me and you're not an expert in all the Greek terminology and you studied Greek mythology for exactly 1 unit back in 7th grade, you might be asking, who is Zagreus?
Yeah.
That's not a person I've heard of before.
Yeah. I've read all of the Percy Jacksons, and he's not in there.
He's not in any of the Percy Jacksons, or in any of the many follow-ups to Percy Jackson. I watched the Disney Plus show. He wasn't there.
Dear listener, I've not read a single Percy Jackson. Don't at me about Percy freaking Jackson.
I don't believe Zagreus is a character in Percy Jackson, because those are young adult novels, and here in just a second we're going to explain why Zagreus is maybe not a character who's going to show up in some young adult novels.
He's for adults.
Well, unfortunately, yes. As with all Greek myths, we kind of only have fragmented references to a character by this name. So, fun fact, everyone, he is a character from Greek mythology.
Wow.
He's just kind of mentioned sporadically across different like poems and plays and so forth. But we have an excerpt from the Encyclopedia Britannica, Spencer, if you wouldn't mind reading to all of our friends who Zagreus is.
Well, let's just see here. According to the encyclopedia, Zagreus in Orphic myth was a divine child who was the son of Zeus as a snake. I guess that means Zeus was a snake?
Zeus was a snake, yes.
Cool. He loved being animal.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, he was the son of Zeus as a snake and his daughter Persephone. Okay, all right.
You gotta keep pushing through. It's Greek.
Okay. Zeus intended to make Zagreus his heir and bestow on him unlimited power. But Hera, Zeus's wife, out of jealousy, urged the Titans to attack the child while she beguiled him with toys. Okay. The Titans, who were opposed to Zeus's power, tore Zagreus to pieces and consumed every part of him except for his heart. Oh, that's sweet, I guess. Athena,
Great. Child murder.
well, almost child oblivion, but left his heart. Athena managed to save the child's heart and brought it to Zeus, who swallowed it, okay? Zeus punished the Titans for their crime by blasting them into soot with his thunderbolts. From these remains arose mortals, who were partly wicked and partly divine. Zeus then begot a son in the body of Semele, and this child, made from the heart of Zagreus, was called Dionysus. Okay,
Yeah, so y'all, they
changed
right? Some of that stuff for the video game.
Yeah, I don't need to read that again. Everyone got all that? That wasn't confusing at all, right?
Yeah, they changed some of that stuff for the video game. Because anytime you can edit out a father impregnating his own child while disguised as a snake,
please do.
You should.
You should.
That's a good call.
That's just good writing advice.
Don't put that in your story. Yeah, they overhaul almost all of that. There is a joke in the game because Dionysus is one of the characters that you can meet. And they play this prank on Orpheus where they pretend to be the same person. So he'll write this like epic song about him or about them. But that's the only nod to that origin story that is in this version at all.
I mean, that's absolutely bonkers.
Yeah, well, that's Greek mythology for you, baby.
I guess.
They're all like that. In this version, Zagreus is the son of Hades, and as Zagreus himself discovers just before the events of the game, Persephone. So Persephone is still his mom, but in this version, she is married to Hades at the time, and she, in this version, is the daughter of the goddess of the harvest, who I was taught that this name was Demeter. They do pronounce it Demeter.
Both are, I've heard both. Yeah, it's okay.
So I'm going to say Demeter just because that's what they say in the game. But anyway, that's Persephone's mom, and Persephone's father is a mortal man. I'm only bringing that up because it will be important later. But Zagreus' parentage is important because up to, the events of the game, he was raised to believe his whole life that he is the son of Hades and the goddess of night, Nyx, because Nyx lives in the house of Hades, and she and Hades have what I will call the two people left in a polycule after the person they both joined the polycule to get with has left.
Yeah, that's relatable. Anyway.
I'm just saying there's some strange sexual politics happening in the House of Hades that let Zagreus believe that these two people could conceivably be his parents while also not really liking each other very much. So he believes that his mother is the goddess of night, but when he is awoken in the middle of the night one night and goes snooping through his father's desk, he finds a letter, which reads,
Hades, I can no longer tolerate my life here in this place, so I am leaving, even if it kills me. I won't be returning to Olympus. If there is a place where I belong in this world, it must be somewhere between heaven and hell. Perhaps it's on the coast and has a little garden. Take care of Cerberus. I shall miss him. Signed, Persephone.
What?
Bum, bum, bum.
It is at this point that the narrator of the game, who I don't know if it's even revealed in this game, but who is Homer.
Homer Simpson.
Lets slip that this Persephone is Zagreus' true mom, which is a thing he did not know until the narrator of his life told him that. And so he is a little bit upset. And since Zagreus has always kind of felt very different from everyone else in the house, and specifically, different from both Hades and Nyx.
I'm not like other gods.
I'm not like other gods. I'm very lonely. No, that's not true. He has some friends in the house. He's kind of buddies with Hypnos, who is the god of sleep, and Thanatos, who is the god of death. He's not, totally alone in the world, but he is, very clearly different, and everyone treats him like he's different. And so he goes to Nyx with this note and is like, hey, who is this Persephone person and why have I literally never even heard anyone say her name before? And Nyx just folds like a damn house of cards and is immediately like, oh shit, that's your mom. We've been lying to you. Oh God, I'm sorry.
Pocket sand. And then she disappears into the night.
Yeah, no, she's been lying to him his whole life. And the moment he gets an inkling that anything is wrong, she's just like, oh God, I'll tell you everything. It's fine. So she says Persephone really is your birth mother. She left right after you were born. And the reason you've never heard her name before is because Hades has expressly forbidden anyone from saying the name anywhere in the house.
Very good coping mechanism. Extreme, excellent use of power.
Yeah, I can't imagine why he would be doing that. So weird.
Just a good law. Just a good
super
rule.
Weird.
Yeah.
And that's particularly bad for Zagreus because he has never left the house. He's never left the underworld. He's never left the house. He is not allowed to leave the house. So he has gotten no other information really about anything, but particularly about his real mother. So of course he's like, well, I'm gonna go and find her because I want to know the truth.
I'm just curious for our listeners out there who are adopted or know adopted people. Like, I don't know. I wonder how this game would hit for them. You know, how do these stories of seeking out or reuniting with long lost parents, like, how does that really stack up to actual lived experiences? Because I don't know, it's not one of mine.
Yeah, and I mean, at least in the game, there are, characters who kind of point out to Zagreus that, like, well, functionally you did have a mother. Like, right. Nyx raised you.
She's the mother who stepped up.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's what you do when you're left in a polycule. But part of his journey, at least, is that while Nyx was very good to him, not everyone was very good to him.
Oh.
And so he is maybe driven to seek out some types of parenting that he did not receive. So in order to facilitate this, Nyx puts him in contact with the goddess Athena, and they decide to continue the lie that Nyx is his mother. We don't know why they're lying about that yet, but we'll find out, saying like, oh, he's definitely the son of Hades and Nyx, and he just really hates it down here, and he wants to be up on Mount Olympus with you guys so bad, and can you please help him get out of here so he can come join you on Mount Olympus with all the good gods that we actually want to hang out with, not like the shitty gods in the underworld that everyone hates. And that, of course, works because the Greek gods,
they love a beguiling.
Yeah, they're easily beguiled. And so they all fall for it. They're all like, oh, of course, a new god. Of course he wants to come and hang out with us and not down there with Hades. We're going to show up and give you boons, which are just like little powers that help him out in combat. But the player knows that Zagreus' actual goal is just to get to the mortal worlds and find his mother, because all that they know about where she went is that she's not in the underworld anymore and she's not on Mount Olympus.
Here's a fun connection to actual Greeks. I believe this is one of the 3 types of irony that Aristotle enumerated in his Poetics.
Oh, wow.
Dramatic irony, where we, the audience, know something that the character knows they know, but other characters do not, or something like that. I'm pretty sure that's a direct quote from the Greek. That's how he explained it.
That's how he said it in
just
Greek.
Like
that was flawless Greek.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, that sounds right. I believe you.
I have a PhD, so...
Okay. So, I mean, I will not take you through a point-by-point replaying of the game because it mostly goes in loops. But basically, in each of these escape attempts, Zagreus fights a bunch of different enemies in the shape of shades, which are just the spirits of dead people in each level of the underworld who try to keep him from escaping. He meets some friends along the way in the form of the spirits of Sisyphus and his good friend, the Boulder, who he does treat as a therapist. Eurydice, the wood nymph, and here's another name. Patroclus is how they say it. I don't know.
I really thought I'd heard Petrocles or something closer to that, but
I don't know, man.
Like Heracles, Petrocles or something. I don't know. It doesn't matter.
There's not an E anywhere in it, which is why
I can't. There's so many words on this
anyway,
page.
Patroclus, the fallen soldier, they all kind of give him helpful resources too. He also gets in some fights with some friends, one of whom is Megara the Fury, who is his ex-girlfriend.
Not to be confused with Meg from Disney's Hercules.
No.
Who is furious, but not a Fury.
Yeah, not a Fury. He also eventually fights her sisters, Alecto and Tisiphone. He fights a Bone Hydra.
The Bone Hydra.
And he also fights... My least favorite part of this game is King Theseus and his very good, totally platonic friend Asterius the Bull, or the Minotaur, actually. That fight sucks.
Yeah?
It sucks, and
Why?
I hate it. Because it's hard.
Oh.
Because Theseus has a shield and you have to hit him from behind. And anyway, it doesn't matter. And of course, the final hurdle he has to clear before he escapes to the surface world is his own father, Hades.
What?
Who, it must be said, does not want his son to leave.
He fight his dad?
He fight his dad.
Wow.
Yeah.
You think that's like a metaphor or something?
Not in this game. In this game, it's literal.
Oh.
Either you murder your dad or your dad murders you.
Well, that's just life, man. Like, if that's not what it's like to be a son, I don't know what it is.
Oh, God.
You know?
Unfortunate.
Am I right, boys?
Am I right, boys? You all had to murder your father to be allowed to interact with your mom, right?
The way you said that, like, let's just move on. Interact with your mom? Come on now, Kelcee. We're not talking about Oedipus.
I was
Oedipus.
not referencing Oedipus. Anyway. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how Hades is depicted in this game, because it is kind of interesting. So in the original myth, which they do borrow from pretty heavily here, Hades ended up as the god of the underworld more or less by chance. So after Hades and all of his various siblings kill their father, who is the Titan Kronos, an action I am sure will never come back to bite any of them, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus all sort of draw lots to see who's going to oversee the sky, the sea, and the underworld. And wouldn't you know it, our boy Hades got the short straw and ended up under the earth for all eternity. But at least as depicted in this game, that is a good thing, because running the underworld is mostly like an administrative undertaking. Like, the House of Hades, as depicted in this game, is basically the lobby that all spirits have to pass through in order to, get to Hades. He takes a record of their lives, writes it all down, files it away in an administrative chambers, and then sends them off to whichever part of the underworld they're supposed to go to.
In Christian mythology, think the pearly gates and St. Peter sitting up there with his quill pen, you know.
Yes, but one of the many psychopomps we see in this game is Hades.
Do you want to tell our readers
what a psychopomp is?
Yeah, excuse me. Do you want to tell our listeners?
Our readers?
Our readers.
All right, write this down, everyone.
Yeah.
A psychopomp is just someone who kind of helps people navigate the bridge between life and death. So, like, another character we'll see in this game is the boatman Charon.
Oh, yeah.
Who is, in Greek mythology, sort of guides people down the river Styx and, like, takes your spirit from the living world to the land of the dead.
The only Karen I care about.
Yeah, the only good Karen.
The only good Karen.
I'm just kidding. But yes, in Christian mythology, St. Peter guarding the curly gates?
The curly gates.
The pearly gates is also filling the role of psychopomp. But anyway, as it happens, that administrative chamber where he files away all of his records about every person who's ever died is where Hades tries to put Zagreus to work, doing some just like unspecified organizational task to which Zagreus could not be more poorly suited. But even though Hades is in a bad mood throughout this entire story, and it's implied just sort of his entire life, he is pretty well suited to this work. Zeus and Poseidon are both much more like bombastic and impulsive and vindictive, and you could see any of them making really terrible choices about punishing mortals for all eternity just because they think it's funny or because they looked at him funny or whatever. At least in this version of the story, Hades is doing a good job in the role that he was assigned, even if he doesn't super want to be doing it. What he is not well suited for is fatherhood. Because
or just like emoting.
Well, emoting in any way that is not just yelling in anger.
Yeah, it's pretty good at anger.
The target for his anger more than anyone else is his son Zagreus. So Zagreus is like very energetic, he's outgoing, he's erratic, he doesn't like sitting still. One of his superpowers is that he run fast. He likes sparring with Achilles, who has been taken out of the part of the underworld he was supposed to be in to just stand around in the house, teaching Zagreus how to use a sword. He can't clean his room, he sprints everywhere he goes, and so he is not good at sitting at a desk and filing paperwork, or whatever it is that he's supposed to be doing. And Hades finds this incredibly frustrating and does nothing whatsoever to conceal that frustration.
Would you diagnose Zagreus with AD Hades?
Swear to God. I'm going to make a TikTok that's like, here's 10 signs that you have AD Hades. You run everywhere. Your bedroom is a mess.
Your footprints catch on fire.
Your dad hates you. Okay. Jesus Christ. So most of the interaction that we see between Zagreus and his father obviously take place after Zagreus has already chosen to leave the house. And so Hades is being like just outright hostile to him. And that's before Zagreus even like finds out a bunch of stuff about his mom. But we get every so often little like flashbacks to interactions that they have at some point when Zagreus is growing up. And it is just relentlessly bad. I mean, there are like dozens of these that kind of get triggered throughout the game, but Spencer, would you mind breaking us off a piece of just a couple of the encouraging little, aphorisms that Hades has to, shape his son into a good man?
Yeah, sure. Well, he gives him such good advice as, watch where you step, you oaf. My house is not a sty through which to track your filth. Which I feel like I heard my mom say, like, a lot.
Yeah.
Take your shoes off before you walk into the house. Okay, let's move on to the next one. You are a weakling, boy. Disgraceful. Now, strike again and make it hurt this time. Oh, my God.
Healthy and normal. Good.
Here's a good one. Why do you bleed like mortals do? An aberration, nothing more, and nothing to be proud of. I suggest you keep it to yourself.
Yes. Shame your children for things they cannot help. Good. A+ parenting. You're doing great, Hades. Keep going.
And he's really stuck on these bodily fluids. Disgusting. Fling your blood at me like that again, boy, and I'll have you cast into the Styx, where you can drown in it.
Yeah.
Really uplifting stuff.
Really good, encouraging, no, these are bad things to say to a kid.
So far we have attacks on their behavior, their personal strength, and just their bodily composition all together.
Yeah, Hades is really stuck on the fact that Zagreus bleeds just regular person blood, despite the fact that he is an immortal god. And that is especially egregious given that there is a reason that Zagreus bleeds like that, and Hades does in fact know what it is. But we will get there. So basically Zagreus is just raised by this horrible, cold, mercurial, critical person who just doesn't, for a single moment of his life, let him feel like he is good at anything. And so even without, like, the whole lying to your son about who his mom is thing, it's not particularly difficult to see why Zagreus would want to leave this situation. Once Zagreus starts trying to escape, Hades becomes even more hostile. So every time that Zagreus dies, he washes up back into the river Styx that deposits him in that, like, waiting room that all the spirits go to. And so Hades is always sitting there at his desk and just mocks him every time he washes up. And whenever Zagreus tries to make like cosmetic changes to the house, Hades accuses him of wasting money, despite the fact that there's like literally nothing else for Zagreus to spend money on except doing stuff to the house, but that's beside the point. At a certain point, you get a mini quest to renovate the lounge portion of the house, and Hades goes on this whole long tangent about how like, well, the only reason that it got damaged is because Cerberus got so upset when you left and he thought you were never coming back, and he was so scared and worried and hurt that he destroyed the whole lounge, and it's all your fault.
That's how Cerberus felt. That's how Cerberus the dog. felt.
Oh, God.
Yeah, Kelcee, why do you think he's saying all of these mean things and then also fighting so hard to not allow Zagreus to escape? It seems like these two things are at odds with one another. Like, so strange. Could it be that Hades is saying one thing but really feels something else?
No.
Oh, okay.
No man has ever done that.
No, I didn't think so. I that was stupid. I'm done.
I think he's just evil to his core.
Oh, yeah, typical.
And there's nothing more complicated going on with him. That's why I brought him to this podcast where we have compassionate conversations about masculinity.
Open and shut case,
yep.
Johnson.
Shut it down. He's evil. I don't know, man. Sometimes a guy's just evil.
End of show.
To tell ya. No. As many characters tell Zagreus throughout the story, because it's not just Hades who is like mad that Zagreus is doing that. Everyone, basically except for Nyx and like a little bit Achilles, is like really upset that Zagreus is trying to leave the underworld. And they all kind of have different reasons for doing that. That again, they won't tell him because Hades won't let anybody talk about anything in the house, and everybody who lives there works for him. But we do get a sense from, characters like Thanatos and Meg, who have been Zagreus' friends for a long time, that like, you are making something more complicated and difficult than it needs to be, and somehow we're all gonna pay for that. But none of them are willing to talk about what that is or why it's happening.
A mystery.
A mystery. But the first time that you beat Hades in combat, you like get all the way out of the underworld, and as Hades is like lying on the ground dying, he says, "Fine, if you want to go find her, go find her. But tell her that Cerberus is doing well."
Oh.
Which is kind of a weird thing to say about your estranged wife, who you refuse to let anyone talk about, and you don't want your son to go and find, because presumably the reason you would do all that is because you hate her, right? And if so, why would make a point to say Cerberus is doing well? The one creature that she expressed any affection for as she was leaving.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Interesting indeed. I mean, it's the same reason that he kept that letter hidden away in his desk, right? He's fixated. He's fixated.
Yes.
The one thing he could glean as an instruction from this woman who left him is to take care of the dog. And so if he can communicate anything to her, it's that the dog is doing okay, as if to say,
I did what you wanted.
Twisted little way, I still love you!
Well, that's a spoiler. I haven't gotten there yet.
Oh, it's obvious. He took care of the dog.
Okay. Well, Zagreus doesn't know that yet.
I've seen Marley and Me. I haven't.
Once you get to Persephone and you talk to her, you find out that, the situation is more complicated than just Hades being a bad, terrible person who she didn't want to be married to anymore. She left because Zagreus was stillborn. And she could not handle the grief. Which is interesting because you'll note,
he's
as
not
the player
stillborn now.
You are in fact playing as Zagreus. So something has happened here. So Persephone's backstory in this story, again, like there are lots of Persephone stories, but in this case, she ended up in the underworld in the first place because she used to live on Mount Olympus, where all of the idiots are, and where her mother, Demeter, was extremely overbearing and controlling, and she hated it there. She wanted a change, and in the sort of palace that she grew up in, there was this portrait of Hades, who of course she had never met, because once he was sent to the underworld, he had to stay there. He's not allowed to leave. But she saw this portrait of him, and she always admired it. She thought he was really...
What a freaking hunk.
What a hunk. I mean, there's a lot of man. Hades is a whole lot of man. That is what I will say.
Big old broadside of beef.
Oh, yeah. And Zeus, who... in this case, I think is her uncle, saw her admiring this portrait of his brother and was like, "Oh, all right, you want him? Okay." And so he just kind of scooped her up and deposited her down in the underworld, just kind of at Hades' feet, and was like, have fun, brother, and peaced out and left her there. And very importantly, did not tell anyone that he had done that. And so Hades was just like, what do I do with this woman who's just here now? And so he, over time they like fell in love and blah, 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 and they got married. And despite the fact that there is a prophecy from the fates that Hades would never have an heir, she was like, I'ma risk it. I'ma risk it for the biscuit, and tried to have a kid. But it was, as far as she was concerned, not to be, because the child was born already dead.
Wow.
And she was so overcome with grief that she left the underworld entirely.
To find a garden by the sea.
Yeah. Ultimately, Nyx, using special nighttime magic, was able to revive Zagreus. But by the time whatever happened, Persephone was already too far gone, and she had specifically asked Nyx to cloak her as in such a way that no one would ever be able to find her, including Nyx. So Nyx kind of knows that she went to the surface, but even she can't see where Persephone went. And as far as Hades knew, she left, and she was not going to come back under any circumstances. Yeah. And so in his mind, he thinks, well, I'm respecting her wishes. She thinks she's better off without me. I'm not going to interfere with that. And the other wrinkle in the plan is also because no one except for Zeus up on Mount Olympus knows where she went. And she's been gone for, however many centuries or millennia at this point. In order to find her, he would have to get in touch with Olympus and be like, oh, hey, Demeter, your daughter who disappeared without a trace and who you think is dead? I had her. But I did lose her too. Do you know where to find her? He does not want to have that conversation. He's like, I'm just going to let her go, and I'm going to respect her wishes, and I'm going to be a real dick about it.
Really easy to internalize her leaving as his fault. Mm-hmm. Because it was a prophecy about him not being able to have an heir, and she really reaped at least half of those consequences, right? And her also not being able to have a child, she thought. And then Zagreus shows up, though, so then, why isn't game over, happy ending? Come home, Mom. I'm here. Let's go.
Yeah, I know we talk a lot about masculinity on this show and
video games, apparently.
And the various hang-ups that men are socialized to have. But here's a sort of controversial thing that I have come to believe, and I hope you can forgive me for saying this, but sometimes women also have issues. Is that
what?
We didn't have a boo sound effect?
I was trying to go for this one. Preach.
Thank
Preach.
you.
Yes.
Thank
Women
you.
have issues. You heard it here first, people. Women have issues.
So
Kelcee said it.
Yeah, once Zagreus rolls up to her house and is like, hey, what's up? I'm your son and I'm not dead.
Hey.
And then because Zagreus is a child of the underworld, he also can't live on the surface, so he then just drops dead in front of her a bunch of times in a row. Her tune starts to change a little bit, and she is willing to sort of talk to him a little bit more about what her relationship with Hades is actually like. Because, Zagreus's initial assumption is like, oh, you left because he abused you and he kidnapped you and he dragged you down to the underworld and you didn't even want to be there in the first place. And she's like, no. I mean, somebody did drag me down there, but it wasn't him. And he was very good to me. And so we start unraveling a little bit of the mystique around Hades. He wasn't always like that, it turns out. He's always been kind of gruff, but he wasn't like an asshole until a really big bad thing happened to him.
Quick plug for Hades Town, the musical. Similar treatment of the characters. It was good for a while, and then things changed, his obsessions, right?
Yes.
That's the sort of through line between both depictions, is throwing themselves into the work and the materialism as a way to avoid real human connection, because we have all these quotes here that show us that this Hades from the video game really doesn't think highly of mortality and humanity and these things that make you vulnerable, like bleeding.
Yeah. Well, and the things that he hates the most about Zagreus, speaking of the bleeding, the reason that Zagreus bleeds the way that he does is because on his mother's side, his grandfather was a human being.
What?
His grandfather was mortal, which is why Demeter is punishing all of Earth. She thinks that Persephone's like half mortal status got her killed, and so she's punishing all of humanity for it, which of course is very misguided and makes her very dangerous. That being a part of Zagreus and something that like visibly marks him. The way that Zagreus looks is also like half of his face looks like his dad, so he has one red eye, and the other half he has a green eye like his mom. So when you look at Zagreus, you can't not see Persephone, and that is why Hades is so hung up on, like, don't look at me, don't bleed on me. Every time I look at you, I remember her. And it just reminds me of how inadequate I was in that arena of my life. And it makes me feel inadequate in this arena of my life. And I don't want to be reminded of it. And so I need you to go away.
Boys? Any of that sound familiar? Boys?
Oh, God. Yeah. And Zagreus ultimately manages to put all of those pieces back together. Like, oh, the reason that he's being such an asshole is because he loves Persephone. And
Spoiler! Spoiler!
He is equal parts trying to protect her and, like, deeply hurt by her. And so it manifests in him trying to keep Zagreus and himself away. And this is where my favorite part of Zagreus' character comes into play, because Zagreus is a meddler. This man is the biggest busybody I've ever seen in my whole life. All of the subplots in this game are just Zagreus trying to get, like, romantic couples back together. He parent traps 3 different groups of people. A bunch of the people that he is either friends with and that he grew up with, or that he meets out in the underworld, are people who have been separated by Hades. Achilles lives in his house, and as he's moving through the underworld, he finds Patroclus, who were, you know, lovers in real life. Patroclus died first, and Patroclus was not supposed to end up in Elysium, which is like the heaven of Greek mythology. But when Achilles died and came to the underworld, he made a deal basically saying, I will work for you, Hades, if you will give Patroclus my place in Elysium, which is very sweet. But it also means that the two of them are separated forever.
And Achilles has big Hades energy here because, like, that seems like a really nice thing to do, but that's also his way of distancing himself from a very uncomfortable conversation about how Patroclus died in the first place.
Yes. So Patroclus, again, we can't go into all of Greek mythology, but basically they were both soldiers together in the Trojan War. Achilles was refusing to fight, even though he was the best warrior who ever lived. So Patroclus stole his armor, went into battle as Achilles, and got himself killed. And in a rage, after losing his lover, Achilles, you know, went on a rampage, killed a bunch of people, and got killed himself. And so it's essentially like Patroclus throughout the game is very explicit. Like every time Zagreus is like, oh, but he was so sad when you died. He did all these things. And Patroclus is like, that's stupid. We could have just lived. We could have just been together in real life. That doesn't help me. I was already dead by the time he did his big romantic gesture. It doesn't help. It was stupid. Oh, and then he came to the underworld and sacrificed himself here too. Great. Now I'm alone. Like, he's just sitting in this little, like, grove by himself for all eternity, thinking about how sad he is.
Here's a Greek word we should have all learned in high school. Hubris.
Yeah.
Okay. Hubris.
Yeah. So one of the things that Zagreus does is help get the two of them back together via contract-related shenanigans. The same with Orpheus and Eurydice. He meets Eurydice out in Asphodel, and she's also like, oh, Orpheus is sad about me? Cool, great, I'm still dead. Like, he should have been sad about me back when he could have done something about it. I am not impressed by him, and he has to, like, navigate that, like, okay, how do I get these two back together? It's just like, welcome to Zagreus' couple counseling. We're going to talk it out. He's kind of like a bumbling idiot about it a little bit. Zagreus doesn't understand not wanting to talk about something that's bothering you. So anytime someone's like, I don't really want to talk about that, he's like, why? Is it because you're sad? If you're sad, you should talk about it. Do you want me to go tell Eurydice you're still in love with her? I think that's really going to help. And they're like, no, she's not going to want to hear. Please don't meddle in the middle. And he's like, nope, I'm going to tell her I'm already going.
This is where I need to give a PSA as someone who identifies a bit with Zagreus here, and just suggest to you that parent trapping people or forcing them to talk about these things that they're perhaps not ready to talk about, especially by luring them into the same room and then saying, here you are, like, talk about all these things, go. It's not a great strategy for real life. Like, it might work well in a roguelite, but I've done it, and I don't think I'm friends with a lot of those people anymore. So
yeah,
let people grow or not on their own time, and trying to find some healthy ways to help them, but maybe not intervene.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that is also sort of a lesson that Zagreus learns, because there are people who are like, hey, I mean, ultimately, like, I'm glad that you found a way for me to go and see Patroclus in Elysium, but, like, this kind of wasn't any of your business. And, like, maybe next time you should ask people before you just go, like, shredding their contracts for them or whatever.
Yeah.
So he does kind of grow in that way throughout the story. But fortunately for the sort of Hades family, he really puts his foot down with Persephone. So we're sneaking into Daddy's bedroom. We're rifling through all of his capes. We're finding his secret portraits of our mom that he's kept on his bedside all this time because he's still in love with her. We are guilt-tripping our mom into inadvertently abandoning us and then advertently abandoning us to hide in her little garden instead of coming home and talking to her damn husband like a grown-up.
And petting the dog.
Come pet the dog, Mom. She misses you. He misses you? I guess Cerberus is a boy. Although Cerberus has 3 heads, so I don't know.
But how many genitals,
And which ones are they? That's all that matters. Anyway, he literally says to his mom at one point, we can't keep running from our problems. We have to take care of each other. Because that's part of it, too, for him, right? He's like, the stakes for me are not just like, do I get to talk to both of my parents regularly? It's like, my father tortures me, and he does it because he's upset at you, and that is not fair. So if you want to be a mom, which you tell me like, oh, you're so upset that Hades never told you that your son was alive and you missed out on a chance to be a mom. Okay, show up right now. Show up. Let's go. Call Charon. Let's go.
I mean, this dynamic was very real as a child of the 90s. Most of my friends had divorced parents. Like, most of them, actually. And most of them had parents who were both in their lives, and they, like, split time. They were at, dad's on the weekends or vice versa. They 1 week at a time or whatever. And this depiction of a parent sort of taking out frustrations inadvertently on the child because of the other parent, and the he said, she said, like, using the child as the messenger go-between thing. Like, God, it was so disgusting and hard to watch and just awful as a kid. Like, and this game, I mean, it nails that. I don't envy that for my boy Zag.
I mean, that is literally the mechanic of the game for, like, the first 2/3 of it or whatever, is just literally you have to fight all the way up to the surface. You get 1 line of dialogue from Dad, you get to Mom, you get 1 line of dialogue from her, and then you have to start all over again being like, well, Mom said this. And it's like, oh, I bet she did say that. Well, did you tell her I said this? And then you have to fight all the way out of the underworld to be like,
damn it,
he
let
said
me go
this.
Fight the Bone Hydra again, and I'll... Damn it. Do y'all not have mail? Like...
You both know Hermes. I know you know Hermes.
Christ.
The end, quote unquote, of the game does involve making it to the surface enough times that Zagreus has time to convince Persephone to come back down to the underworld with him and patch things up with Hades.
Wow.
Now, famously, this game is 1.5 billion years long. So there are lots and lots and lots of other things you could do after you have reached that point. That's just the point where the credits play. So I'll mention some other things really quickly. So eventually, Hades does apologize to Zagreus in this very, like, gruff, dadly way. And it is the first time in the game that Hades calls him by name and doesn't just call him boy. And he agrees to let Zagreus take on a new job. Basically, you get to keep breaking out of the underworld just to, like, show Hades where, like, the security issues are so he can, beef up security in the underworld because nobody's supposed to be able to get out, right?
Right.
You can tie up some romantic storylines for Zagreus with both Thanatos and Megrada, and I do mean both. And you can tie up a storyline with Adusa, who is a floating gorgon head who works as a housekeeper in the House of Hades. And I really recommend playing the game just to see how that plays out, because it's very cute. You can also, if you play long enough, reconcile Hades and Persephone with all the other Olympians, including Demeter, who, again, is just killing humans in droves. The sort of background happening in this story is like, so many people are starving to death that the House of Hades is just swamped with dead people. And also there's a war going on over resources, so Thanatos is never around because so many people are dying so frequently that he basically has to be on the surface at all times. So you try to get her to stop doing that.
And this is all sort of a spin-off of the original Persephone myth of like when she's in the underworld is when we experience winter on the surface world because Demeter is sad.
Demeter.
And then when Persephone gets to visit Olympus, that's when we have spring and summer. But in this game, Demeter is just like casting the world into a bitter ice age. Hence the resource battle and just massive starvation.
Yeah. We'll get to this a little bit later in the discussion. I think she's the cruelest, most violent character in the whole thing. But anyway, and the other, you can try to figure out what's going on with Skelly. The truth is out there.
Yeah.
See if you can figure it out. The moral is, at the end of the story, Zagreus and Hades do not have a perfect relationship. They're still sort of contentious and uncomfortable with each other, but there is this sort of begrudging respect that grows. But we, as the player, are led to believe that there is hope, at least, that these two will learn to understand each other better and be able to build a better relationship going forward, provided that nothing, catastrophic happens that would interrupt their relationship with one another, which I'm sure, again, it's fine. Nothing bad is going to happen.
Yeah, I can't imagine anything that would.
Yeah. And so that's kind of where the story ends.
Wow.
So before we get to the sort of bulk of our discussion about the themes of this game, particularly as they apply to masculinity, I do want to give just a sort of brief disclaimer about the source material that it is drawing from. So this game is an adaptation of very, very old source material, which means that they have had to both sort of sand down some of the edges of the, at times, deeply, deeply horrifying myths that these stories are based on, and allow some of their modern sensibilities and biases to work their way in so that it is something that a modern audience will actually want to engage with.
What Kelcee's trying to say is, them Greeks were freaks.
Specifically when it came to the ideas of what made a person, and I will explain here in a little bit how the Greeks defined people, what made them attractive. So if you have heard anything about this game just out in the world somewhere, what you have probably heard is that all the character designs are really, really hot. And I want to be clear about something right now. That is true. That is an indisputable fact. These character designs, basically across the board, very hot.
Super hot.
But what I will say is that the ideals that they are drawing on in these character designs, what makes these characters hot, is pretty specific. So in an article called What Hades Can Teach Us About Ancient Greek Masculinity from Wired, an author named Autumn Wright says, quote, "With different styles and pompous attitudes, each character makes a strong impression. If you're like me, you'll probably crush on a handful of them from the start." In an interview with Kotaku, developer Greg Karasavina said of their character design, "Our portrayals of the gods owe greatly to classical tradition. As interviewer Ash Parrish put it, gods are hot because they are gods. But while there is a great diversity of hair, skin, voice, and presence, the limits of Supergiant's vision quickly become apparent." So one of the criticisms that has been leveled at this game points to the lack of either fat or disabled characters, except as villains, unless you count Dusa not having a body as a disability, which I suppose you could. Outside of her, there really is no depictions of particular body types outside of one very specific body type. But beyond just the not unique to Hades issue of like only having thin, strong characters in your game, it's drawing on even more of the biases of the ancient Greeks. And for our purposes here, when we say ancient Greeks, we mean roughly the 4th and 5th centuries BCE. And the folks back then had some very, very specific ideas about beauty. So, hey, Spencer,
Hey.
As you pointed out earlier, you know something about this era of history and the people writing and doing scholarship around that time. What type of bodies do you think those Greeks would have considered the most beautiful?
I mentioned Aristotle before because everyone likes to talk about his poetics and what we owe to the study of rhetoric due to Aristotle. That's all fine and good. But Aristotle also thought that you weren't a complete person unless you had a penis. So,
Interesting.
Women aren't people, can't be citizens because they don't have the full body and thus are not fully capable of rational thought.
Famously, rational thought stored in the penis.
Yeah.
Famously.
Well, I mean, this wasn't the only really kind of dumb thing he thought. I mean, look, they can't all be dunks, right? He can't be batting 1,000 out here.
Can't win them all.
You know, and so Aristotle also famously believed in what we now call the climate theory of race, where if you were a person who existed in a hotter part of the world, then you had a darker skin tone. And he subscribed to this so much that actually the word Ethiopian is from the Greek, which literally just means burnt faces. Like,
oh my God.
Yeah, so like that clues you into what he thought about
Jesus.
People of darker skin tones or black people in general. And the thing that I think you wanted me to talk about is what I mentioned earlier is this idea that in ancient Greek body culture, there's this idea of arete, which just means cultural virtue, like how virtuous are you as a person. And arete is directly tied to physique and athleticism. And again, they had this belief that a more physically fit, athletic, beautiful, aesthetically pleasing looking person, by whatever cultural standards they defined it as, that person was inherently more virtuous. The fact that they looked that way signified that something about their character, their ethos, if you will, was superior. So like in the Greek pantheon, all the gods are depicted as super hot and buff because they are supposed to be the pinnacle of cultural virtue.
Right. You would never listen to someone who didn't look a particular way.
Right.
As you were saying, this equation of like physical fitness with virtue and knowledge and intellect and all of those things, partially because like back in the day, you would be like getting fit in the same place you'd be going to school. Like isn't that where we get the term gymnasium from?
Yep, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of my work in rhetoric has to do with the fact that athletic body development did happen in the same spaces as intellectual, philosophical, citizen development, political development. And honestly, that was just because like the philosophers of the day realized that that's where they would have the largest audience with land-owning future politicians. Like young men would go to the gymnasia to train in the sort of like arts that were expected of them as the nobility. And so these philosophers who wanted to teach and, you know, on their best days, help people develop a better polis, they would go to the gym, you know, and like in the middle of your sets, teach you a little something about philosophy and art and stuff.
Yeah. So actually the true heir to Aristotle in the modern era is that guy at every gym who, if he sees you're not wearing headphones, will just come over and start like unprompted correcting your form and telling you about various protein powders and so forth. Like that's Aristotle, in case you had any lingering respect for Aristotle.
Yeah, bro, it's like, it's not so much about the angle, but like, it's I can't even imitate. I wish I had
fitness is really
it
just like
in
a
the
state
bag
of
right
mind, if you think about it. It's just all about like getting zen and like one with the universe.
No, but see, you got to do the hypers with the paleo. Like, you got to do the...
I've been doing keto and I actually think it feels great. My wife won't be in the same room as me anymore, but I think it's great. I think it's really working.
Oh, man.
In addition to this intellectual life being equated with, like, how physically strong and thin you are, obviously, the Greeks also did need you to be a man.
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty important. So we have another quote from the Right article.
We need to reorient our understanding of gender and beauty to talk about hotness in antiquity. While our society considers beauty a feminine trait, in ancient Greece, masculinity superseded all. We might as well say that masculinity, cultivated by teaching and training, is beauty. So, hotness, in a classical sense, isn't the traits we as individuals find attractive in other people, but what a society, preserved through fragments of their culture, values, and citizens embodies. The aristocratic elite were even called the good and the beautiful, for their bloodline inherently possessed virtue. There's that word arete that I was mentioning earlier. While we could reduce this to a set of characteristics associated with masculinity, I would suggest that the question should be who, not what, is hot. Hades focuses on Zagreus, who plays such a minor role in myth that, as the titular god of the underworld's sun, he makes a great canvas to fill in for the player character. He's charming, emotionally mature, polychromatic, young, and muscular. Zag is the prototypical beauty. The ephebe, I guess. I don't know what that means.
It doesn't
matter. The ephebe. Anyway, as the locus of masculinity in ancient Greece, the 17 to 18-year-old boy becomes an ephebe after shaving his first beard and beginning a requisite 2 years of military service for the polis. This transitional phase, from the adolescent eromenos to adult man, is when the Greeks regarded the, quote, male body as in peak condition. Ephebes were literally objectified in the civic imagery of that era. Kouroi. Placed around the polis, these statues, depicting nude young men, served as a living symbol for the ideal citizen. Kouroi tells us, as they did citizens of the polis, that the ideal Greek man possesses discipline, control, balance, and symmetry.
Yes. Thank you for reading that very long quote. That's why if you've ever been to a museum that has Greek statues in it, it's just a bunch of like strapping young soldier boys wearing like a helmet and no pants, because that was what was valued at that time. That was the ideal person, and they put those statues up around town to make sure everybody knew what they were supposed to be aspiring to. To be clear, contrary to what you might have heard about supposedly rampant queerness happening in that era, young men were considered to be the most beautiful, but you were expected to grow out of any sort of androgyny in order to become a real man. So while it's like, yes, it's great to be a 17, 18, 19-year-old boy, that is just the time in your life at which you are most beautiful. If you want to be a real man, you have to leave beauty such as that behind. So this is yet another quote from the Right article. I used it a lot. It's worth reiterating here that the mythical figures of Achilles and Patroclus were outliers as intelligibly queer men. After the Eromenos shaves his first beard, he is no longer a boy. Desiring sexual relationships with men into adulthood was disgraceful. Accusations of such behavior became a common oratory practice to discredit an opponent. A man subject to his desires, they argued, was womanly, the worst thing you could be. Women were institutionally and socially subordinate to men in civic life, while their bodies were often portrayed as the antithesis of virtuous masculinity. Statues of women are shown in static poses that signify laziness, that they're undisciplined and asymmetrical alike. When in motion, women are cast as unbalanced for their lack of control over emotion and sexuality. The only agential women existed in myth as goddesses and Amazons, which make a cogent example of the gender binary in Greece. What made the Amazons mythological was their unnaturally hypermasculine behavior and expression in a womanly body, making them literally andro and gyne androgynous. This physique, developed by their own system of training, lent itself to their superior combat abilities compared to mortal women. The Amazons were, however, defeated by Greek heroes like Heracles, serving as just another example of men's naturalized superiority. From the myths, we gain that while both are unnatural, manly women inspire awe and legend, with some cities even crediting their foundation to Amazons, while womanly men can't even stand against an orator. Masculinity, again, supersedes all.
There are some really great feminist histories of ancient Greek rhetorics, like that last bit about women can't even stand up to an orator. There's a famous woman philosopher, rhetorician, orator that was a contemporary of Socrates or Aristotle or somebody. Anyway, that like frequently gave him the business. And I'm going to get her name wrong. I think it's Aspasia.
There is a woman from classical Athens, Aspasia.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. She dunked on Aristotle or somebody
Good
pretty
for
frequently.
her.
Yeah, she was awesome. Like, and she's not alone. But this is just yet another sort of like fragmented history that we have where the winners, the men, the patriarchs are the ones that are preserving the bits that suit them.
Yeah, I mean, so much of our sort of foundational understandings of gender come from, at least in Western society, come from the Greeks. And so it's, you know, it's little surprise that we accidentally replicate so many of these things to this day. And it does manifest in this game in ways that are like, kind of weird. All of the sort of main characters, aside from like Dusa, as we've said, because she doesn't have a body, and I guess maybe Charon because he's a skeleton, and Skelly, who's also a skeleton. It's Skellington?
He's a skeleton.
He's a skeleton. But for the most part, all of the characters, both male and female, have the strapping, half-naked muscle boy bodies. Even characters like Dionysus, who is the god of wine and parties.
Yeah.
Why does that man have a six-pack? He doesn't need one.
Even in our modern depictions, like there are cartoon versions of Dionysus that make him this like fat, grape-eating, jolly, plump dude.
Well, I just think of the Ghost of Christmas Present from A Christmas Carol. Who, I mean,
that's what I was thinking.
He changes depending on who's playing him, but that's usually like a big guy.
Yeah.
Because, you know, when you drink a lot of wine and feast a lot.
And you're filled with mirth.
Yeah, and you're just having a good time. Like, why would that person look like a bodybuilder? Like, it takes a specific type of work to look like a bodybuilder, not just a strong person, a bodybuilder. Why does everyone look like that? And
particularly the women, too. Is it Nyx in this one that has the weird cutoff, like crop top? Or I'm thinking of the other one.
You're thinking of, again, it's just spoilers for Hades, too. Hecate's body don't make no sense.
Doesn't. It's so weird.
I mean, I love and respect my mother, but why she look like that, though? Why her waist so long? And a lot of that is just because, you know, they can try to hide behind, like, well, we're drawing on this ancient Greek source material and, like, we're just being true to whatever. Like, no, a lot of our current culture still falls into that same Aristotelian trap of equating thinness and athleticism with virtue and intellect.
Well, like the idea of the statues that you mentioned, the fact that we look at the female statue poses as like static, thus indicating laziness. What? That's wild. And like, we see that all throughout Western art. I was just showing you pictures of Dante Rossetti's paintings of like this woman brushing her hair, and like it's always like in this very chaise lounge sort of like reclined pose.
Women be lounging.
Just always lounging.
I mean, I do be lounging, but that's my God-given right. Yeah. And that doesn't mean I'm stupid.
Yeah,
I do my best thinking while lounging.
And again, a lot of this just comes back to, you know, the gymnasia, the lyceum, where training could mean muscular development or mental development. So many things had like a physical corollary in ancient Greece. The idea of a mind palace, like having a memory palace be a physical place that you go to. This word topos, topoi being commonplace arguments, like the physical and mental, spiritual, ethical were all intertwined in not great ways. And like you just said, we have this contemporary bias where you see someone who's hot and fit and you're like, wow, they must work really hard. They must have a lot of discipline. Or it's like, no.
They have good genetics.
Yeah, maybe.
That's all that means.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, even...
Or they're rich.
There are ways to draw on the idea of physical training and mental training happening in the same place that aren't. Oh, and also the outcome of this is that your body will be thin and that will be good and virtuous. because obviously there are plenty of perfectly athletic people who are not thin. Like,
freaking sumo wrestlers, am I right?
yes,
Yeah.
you are literally right. Like, that's
Yeah.
not a joke. Those people
No.
are athletes. And I feel like we as a society are maybe like inching bit by bit towards this idea that like maybe the idea of health and bodies and fitness are a little bit more complicated than just like the smaller you are, the healthier you are, and the more athletic you are, and the smarter you are. And like, hopefully we're starting to move past that, but
They're deeply ingrained biases.
yeah,
Like,
exactly. To quote my brother, who just got back from a trip to Berlin a few months ago, you know what Adolf Hitler was also obsessed with? Statues of naked, thin, muscular white boys.
What do you know?
So, you know, obviously, like, if you like a thin, muscular white boy, that doesn't make you a Nazi. It's just that, like, if that's the type of person you think is better than all the other types of people...
Well, oops, you done fascist.
Yeah. Anytime that you find your views sort of accidentally aligning with Nazism, it's maybe time to reconsider some things. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. And just in general, anytime people start talking about ancient Greece as the pinnacle of anything, it's fair to be a little bit suspicious of their motives. I don't think that the creative team behind Hades is trying to uphold these harmful stereotypes about masculinity and body types or anything like that. In fact, the reason we're talking about this game is that I think they deliberately wrote Zagreus in particular to push back on a lot of the traits that we might associate with, you know, quote unquote toxic masculinity. But as we've said, it's very easy to fall into the same trap that the rest of Western society does when it comes to what we consider attractive and therefore valuable. I don't want to dwell for a super long time on this second part of it, but since we did talk about Dusa and how she is just a floating head.
Yeah, what's the deal with that?
So the other real ugly thing about Greek mythology is that it is extremely, extremely violent. And in particular, some of the worst offenders who we see depicted in this game are serial rapists and murderers. So among the worst, if you know anything about Greek mythology, are Zeus and Poseidon, who are Hades' brothers. And we do see them both in this game. They both show up. They want to meet their nephew.
Wait, you mean Zeus, the guy that just kidnapped Persephone and then gave her to his brother as just like a gift and didn't tell anyone about it? You mean that guy's not just like totally chill?
And can I tell you something? That not even in like the top 20 of his worst offenses.
No, I like halfway stumbled through that quote earlier where he was a snake and be done laying with somebody.
Zeus and Poseidon are bad dudes. Dusa, the character, is clearly named as a reference to Medusa, the character who ended up as a Gorgon with snake hair in the first place, because here's just like a trigger warning, maybe skip ahead 30 seconds or so. Poseidon saw her at one of Athena's temples, liked her, and just raped her right there on the steps or whatever. And Athena gave her the snake hair to protect her against sexual violence. And then...
Cool, thanks,
A
Athena.
couple of years later, some dude named Perseus, who is in fact who Percy Jackson is named after, showed up and was like, I need to kill a monster as a quest to become a big important man. And she was like, oh, I know a monster you could kill. That woman who already got raped by my uncle. Here's a shield. Go and kill her and chop her head off.
Chop her head off to continue using as a weapon.
Yes.
Just further objectify her, why don't you?
Yeah. So we have a character in this game who her body's not there. She has been beheaded, and you can't avoid the evidence of that brutality in her design because it's all of her. Her body's gone, and she doesn't want to talk about it. You can try to ask her questions, and she gets really uncomfortable when you start asking her why she don't have a body.
By the way, though, like, if you haven't played this game, she's an extremely cheerful character otherwise. Like, she's, like, really good-natured, very, very solid pal. Really, really nice.
She's lovely. She's one of my favorite characters. But it's clearly masking something, all that cheerfulness. And the game doesn't tell you what it is. So you kind of have to go in already knowing about the myth of Medusa, or you have to kind of seek it out for yourself, because the game doesn't tell you. And you don't get to go and like confront Poseidon or Athena about it. The most that the game does is show Hades as a character being very uncomfortable being compared to either of his brothers. So at a certain point, Zagreus is like, oh, I bet Zeus and Poseidon just gave my mother to you as some kind of consolation prize. Is that what happened? And he's like, well, first of all, Poseidon didn't have anything to do with it. And second of all, how dare you talk about her that way? That is not how I thought of her. That might be how Zeus thought about her, but that is not how I thought about her. And I won't let you talk about her like that in front of me.
Dang.
Which I think is kind of a roundabout way of saying, like, yeah, these other two are really bad to women. They do see women that way. Hades is a villain in his own right, but he's not that kind of villain. Again, this is all without them being like, hey, I didn't rape your mom.
Yeah.
Like,
hey,
and it's a shame to have to even imply that to your own son, but what are you going to do? This game does not necessarily try to reckon with the level of violence in the source material. No one is confronting Zeus and Poseidon for how they treat people. Like, it's hinted at, it's not really dealt with head on. And even like all of these sort of fan theory portrayals of the relationships, like there are a lot of different like books and graphic novels and stuff that depict Hades and Persephone as equals and people who actually like love and respect each other, which is, again, not super borne out by the source material. Obviously, like Achilles and Patroclus are the closest to being like, yeah, they were actually like, they were functionally married. But the source material doesn't explicitly say that. So even including those relationships as like healthy ones is taking liberties with the original myths in order to tell a more compelling story. And like, I want to be clear that I think that's actually good. I think the point of retelling a myth is to do something new and original with that source material and not just regurgitate the same plot beats in a different setting or whatever. This is meant to be a new story that is just inspired by the ancient ones and not the same thing again. So like, changing the material enough that, for example, female characters can participate in this story in a way that the ancient Greeks would not have liked is not a bad change. Creating explicitly queer characters rather than like hiding behind the language of military brotherhood or whatever is a good change. Making relationships that are implied to be non-consensual in the original text into consensual ones in your new text is not like disrespectful to the original story.
And if anything, it's like part of the actual tradition, because what we know about most of these myths is that they were preserved and passed down through oral tradition. So if there was a Homer, then he was reciting these epic poems in parties at gatherings and stuff as part of like a musical performance. And why that's important is not because they couldn't read or write. It's important because that gives you leeway to adjust the story specifically to your audience for the needs of the day, much like people giving a sermon would. Like, you can tell the same parable, but for a different purpose, for like the needs of a new audience as society is changing, as people's attitudes towards certain things are changing. Like, so these were never fixed. That's why we have so many seemingly conflicting myths from what we're calling the source material here. So, like, changing them is important. Changing them is like the point. That's what you're supposed to do. These are supposed to be reflections of people's experiences and questions and fears and doubts and hopes, you know, not like a thing that's not a historical text, you know?
And I'm not including all of this background information to like dunk on this game for not like fixing the problem of sexual violence in Greek mythology, or like say that they are fully at fault for a society-wide fixation on a particular body type or anything.
No, they made a lot of good changes.
I want to
could have made more.
Recognize that there is a lot of like pain and shortcomings in this entire like monolith of Greek mythology. And also say that the goal of this story is not to like make all the bad things that happened in history okay.
Right.
What this story is trying to do is talk about grief.
Yep.
And specifically, throughout this story, we see many characters who are in various stages of grief. And for just about all of them, that grief is manifesting as anger.
I was always taught there were 5 stages of grief, but here recently I've heard that there are 7. Like, I've heard people talk about the 7 stages of grief. Do you know what the deal? I'm just genuinely curious.
Oh God, I don't know them all off the top of my head.
Well,
one of them is
the 5,
acceptance,
yeah,
bartering.
Yeah, denial, anger, bartering, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Those are the 5, and not in that order, I don't think, but those are the 5 that I knew.
Yeah, well, this first article is called The Stages of Grief, How to Understand Your Feelings from Healthline, and it says, learn about the 5 or 7 stages of grief.
Okay, what the fuck?
Oh, yeah.
How many are there?
The top section is, are there 5 or are there 7?
Okay, so I'm not alone. I'm not crazy here.
So in 1969, a Swiss-American psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote in her book On Death and Dying that grief could be divided into 5 stages. Her observations came from years of working with terminally ill patients. In time, 2 more stages were added to make 7 stages. This expanded model aims to better reflect the complexity of grief.
What are the other 2?
Okay, so the original 5 were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
I freaking nailed it. I got it in the right order and everything.
Yeah. Okay, so they've actually expanded on them. Healthline, I do not want to watch this in a video format. I am trying to read your article.
We're trying to record a podcast.
I'm trying to record a podcast, Healthline, my most dubious source of health information. Okay, so the 7 stages of grief. Number 1 is shock and denial. Number 2 is pain and guilt. Number 3 is anger and bargaining. Number 4 is depression. Number 5 is the upward turn. Number 6 is reconstruction and working through. And number 7 is acceptance and hope.
Okay, so they just like expanded, like they just basically said like you don't get to acceptance overnight. It's more of a process and less of a stage.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, yeah, that's true. But also if you just like read the original thing, I'm sure Kubler-Ross explained that, yeah, you don't just wake up one day being like, all right, I'm chill with this. I'm going to die. It's fine.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting that the new model recognizes that this isn't a process that, you know, it's not a straight line, right? You don't start in one place and then just like progress neatly through these stages one at a time and then get to the end point and never do any backtracking or backsliding or anything like that. I think it's good to tell people in a state of grieving that like, hey, if you thought you were at acceptance and you're not anymore, that's fine. Go watch The Bear.
Yeah. Yeah.
They'll tell you.
That's a good point.
You might have thought you were doing fine, and then it turns out you're not. And throughout the game Hades, we see characters kind of moving up and down along that spectrum, and they're all kind of in a different place in their journey. So again, we're not going to go in like super detail about every single character because there are roughly 1 million of them. But there is a pattern in this game of grief specifically manifesting as anger. So there are a number of characters that this happens to. One of them is Thanatos, the god of death, emo boy extraordinaire, Zagreus' lifelong friend. He doesn't show up until you get a pretty significant distance into the game. And that is because he is sulking. You uncover is in love with Zagreus, and as far as he knows, Zagreus's intention is to leave the underworld entirely and never come back. It comes out that that is not something that's possible for Zagreus, but as far as Thanatos knows, Zagreus is leaving, and he didn't say goodbye to Thanatos specifically. And the other sort of layer on top of that is that Thanatos is the god of death, and Zagreus keeps dying over and over and over again. The way that the game shows that Thanatos specifically is very upset that Zagreus keeps dying is in 2 ways. So first of all, he starts showing up during the actual runs, poofs into existence, says something snarky about how, like, I heard you needed help, Zagreus. Like, don't tell anybody that I'm here, but, like, since you're so pathetic and doing such a bad job, I guess I'll come and help you. And then he uses his giant scythe to just, like, kill everything in the level. And he frames it as, like, a competition where it's like, if you can kill more enemies than I can, then I'll give you a special prize. And the prize that he gives you is, they call them centaur hearts in the game. But basically what it does is increase the overall pool of health that Zagreus has, making him harder to kill. And he also gives you a little butterfly pin that you can wear on your collar that makes it so that if you make it through an individual level without getting hit, you get more powerful. So he is like, stop getting hit. It really bums me out. But all of the things that he says to you for the first, like, I don't know, 4 hours worth of interactions that you have with him is he is mad at you. He thinks you're being childish. He thinks it's bad that you're leaving. And when you try to ask him, hey, do you want to, like, talk about what you're actually mad about, Thanatos? He just disappears. He ends the conversation there and just leaves.
I don't understand either, actually. Like, if he's the god of death, why does it upset him that Zagreus dies? Especially if he knows that he's just going to show back up in the House of Hades, which is presumably what he wants. What Thanatos wants is for him to see him again. What's the deal? I think
it's that he's getting hurt in the process. I don't think he likes seeing Zagreus get hurt.
This makes more sense because, like, to Zagreus' story, Zag would not care about the pain and harm that he's inflicting on himself by running through the underworld and trying to reunite with his mom. I mean, this is very much like signs of a self-destructive person who kind of has internalized this belief that they deserve a kind of pain and torture, and maybe that's linked to the idea that, like, he believes a little bit of what Hades kind of demonstrates to him. I mean, that's classic. Like,
there is kind of also a question of who knows what when.
Yeah, sure.
So as Thanatos sort of gets more information and figures out, oh no, you're looking for your mother. You're not just leaving because you are throwing a tantrum and you don't want to be here anymore and you're a spoiled brat. You're leaving for a reason. But he also has this little bit of, like, my family wasn't good enough for you. Like, Thanatos is definitely making things about him that are not about him, but that is how his hurt feelings are manifesting into him just being kind of mean, and then in ways that he doesn't want to talk about being very nice.
Gotcha.
The other sort of romantic partner for Zagreus, who is a bit more justifiably angry, is Megara. And to be fair, she is a Fury. Which means that being angry is her job. The Furies punish evildoers. There are 3 of them. They all have slightly different roles, but Megara is kind of the head Fury. And so she is the one who is put in charge of trying to keep Zagreus from leaving initially. So she is the first boss that you fight in the game, and she has a whip, and she hits you really hard with it, and she clearly does not feel great about it, because she has been given an order from her ex-boyfriend's father to kill him over and over again to prevent him from leaving the house. And she is like, how dare you put me in this position? And I kind of think she's right. Like, I would also be mad if a person that I really liked, again, he is leaving her as well, as far as she knows. And then also his dad is like, hey, you have to go and stop him. You will lose your job if you don't try to kill my son.
Yeah, this is buck wild. I didn't know they were, like, had a romantic past.
Yup.
Megara and Zagreus. Yeah, that's awful of Hades. Like, what a coward to, like, get you.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so gross. Get your
really
son's
awful.
ex-girlfriend to try and keep him, like, in your small town because you want him to take over the family business, basically. Like,
yeah. Or not even that, just like, I have set a ground rule that my son needs to follow these rules, and instead of trying to enforce those boundaries myself, I'm gonna make his former girlfriend do it. That sucks.
Yeah.
And then as the game progresses and it gets sort of steadily more difficult, you can also start fighting her sisters, who she hates. And there is a way to make all 3 of them fight you at once. And she gets so mad at you if you do that, because she's like, why are you making me hang out with my terrible sisters who scream about murder all day long? Justice for Meg. So a person who, depending on your perspective, maybe has a little bit less claim to a different manifestation of anger is Persephone. So we don't see her acting out of rage, where she is not being like physically violent towards either Zagreus or any of the other shades, but she is so steeped in grief and fear. I don't know. Maybe she is the one who is just sort of stuck in the depression phase, where the way that she is behaving is not necessarily intended to be hurtful, but is, in fact, extremely hurtful. Like, I don't have experience losing a child that I really wanted. And anytime that, like, miscarriages and stillbirths and things like that happen, like, I'm very inclined to say whatever the person who actually was going to or ended up giving birth feels and however they react is pretty much fully justified. And I'm pretty much in favor of people in those situations acting however they feel the need to act. And so I think wanting to leave a place that reminds you of something that painful is, like, justified. But as the story progresses, Persephone becomes harder and harder to understand. And especially as you gain more sympathy for Hades as the story goes on, it's a lot easier to see her reaction to her own grief being like, I'm just leaving. Not going to tell you where I'm going. I'm not going to tell you how to reach me. Knowing that Hades would also be in a place of grief and being like, I'm not going to share anything with you from here on out. You're not going to help me. I'm not going to help you. We're not going to have any contact anymore because I am in so much pain. And that she doesn't seem to think until Zagreus shows up and is like, hey, he's awful now, and he's awful to everyone. That's like the moment where it occurs to her, like, oh, he might be in pain too. Mm-hmm. And it's a different kind of pain because, of course, Zagreus did live, and Hades had to raise him and, like, figure out how to keep this secret and, like, do the internal turmoil of, do I try to find her and tell her? Is that going to expose her to more danger? Is that going to expose Zagreus to danger? What if we go and find her and she still doesn't want anything to do with us? That's going to be even worse for Zagreus. Oh God, what do I do? It doesn't occur to her until Zagreus is like, that's not a good situation you left him in, that she's like, oh, that wasn't a good situation I left him in.
Persephone and Hades are kind of the same in some ways. Like,
yeah,
they are dealing with Schrodinger's Zagreus. Like,
a little bit.
I mean,
she is certainly.
Persephone is living in a world where Zagreus died and is stuck in that world, wondering what it could have been like if he had lived, when in fact he did live. And Hades is stuck in a world where Zagreus lived, wondering what it could have been like and what it might be like if he does try to communicate with Persephone that he's alive.
Yeah.
But ultimately what makes them so similar is they surround themselves with something that is familiar so that they can kind of isolate themselves in a comforting environment where they are no longer vulnerable to the thing that hurt them. So
yeah,
we see Hades throw himself into his work. That's all he does. And we see Persephone surround herself with just a small garden by the sea, just isolation, nature, things that she can tend to and cultivate and understand the sort of cycles of. And it's like there's a recalcitrance to change, you know? And so
yeah.
they've been doing this thing. They've developed a habit of their way of being for so long that it becomes another Greek word, hexis.
Ooh.
Yeah, their state of being, this idea of a bodily state that informs your internal life as well, that we talked a little bit about already through like physical training, making you more mentally intelligent, like whatever. But anyway, like because they've been physically in the same space, doing the same actions, it has locked them into a way of seeing the world and a way of thinking about themselves and their place in it that's really, really difficult to change, even when Zagreus confronts them. And that's why, like, this narrative has to be played out in this roguelike fashion where the main character goes and tries multiple times before you can see any real change or progression through those stages of grief, particularly for Hades and Persephone.
Yeah. And you reacted when we watched a recap video with some level of disgust because as excited as Persephone is to find out that Zagreus is alive, and as obvious a conclusion as it would be to be like, oh, well, you go home.
Mm-hmm.
You go home and you pick up where you left off and you try to fix things with Hades and you try to be there for Zagreus, and that's not her initial reaction.
No.
She's excited to see him, and then when he starts saying, like, I don't know, I think Dad might still have a thing for you, and I think it would really help him and me if you were to come back and try to, like, be a family together. And her reaction is like, that's way too dangerous.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to do that. And she uses the excuse of, if the Olympians find out, it's going to be so bad. They're going to, rain down terrible justice on us or whatever, even though she knows that Zeus is the one who sent her there in the first place.
Right.
Zeus looks as bad as anybody else does.
But truly, it's like, it's just a matter of, like, every day that has passed, these people have isolated themselves further and further and stacked another brick in the wall that separates them from the possibility of loving again, becoming vulnerable again, or allowing themselves to hope that there could be a different future. They're just really locked into a sort of self-made prison, as much as they dress it up as, like, my career or my lovely garden. It's like, it's a manifestation of their fear of being hurt again in such a devastating way as they both already were.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that we see Persephone doing what looks like moving backwards in that sort of spectrum of grief, where the thing that she thought had happened, which is she thought her son died, it turns out wasn't true. But then she gets hit with this second form of grief, which is like, and you didn't know about it because you left and you made it impossible for anyone to find you.
Yeah.
And you told them you didn't want to be found. And so as mad as she wants to be at Hades, she kind of has to sit there and be like, I told him not to find me. And I didn't leave a stipulation for, like, actually, if it turns out the kid's still alive, do come find me. But otherwise, don't come find me.
Because why
like,
would you?
Yeah, why would you leave a stipulation like that?
It's
and she moves to the place where Hades is at, which is like, well, it's too big of a mess and I can't fix it, so I'm not going to.
And the biggest thing that I keep thinking about is how, because there are so many characters in this story, you have to remember that people like Persephone and Hades, who know almost all of them, are at different stages of grief with their multiple relationships with different people. And again, that's why it takes so many runs to get through and, like, start tearing down those walls so that they can perhaps move forward out of this little circuit that they've made for themselves.
Yeah. Playing from the perspective of Zagreus, you get the initial, like, I'm going to go and tell my mom she's alive. And of course, that's going to fix everything. She's going to come back and she's going to have perfect answers for everything that I've ever wanted to know about myself, and it's all going to be fine.
Look, Mommy, it's me, your beautiful darling boy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Come home, Mother.
And of course, what he finds out is that, oh, my parents are also complicated people with these sort of layers of different fears and reactions to things that happened so far before I was born that, it's going to be sort of impossible for me to untangle all of that in one conversation too. And one of the things that he runs into with Persephone is she is very afraid of her mother. And that is, it turns out, sort of justified.
Sort of.
I think the scariest character in this game is Demeter.
Yeah.
So we talked earlier. We talked earlier about...
We've already spoken about...
We have spoken about Demeter's choice to send the whole Earth, into an ice age that is just killing human beings in droves. And she is doing that because she talk about a person who is in a Schrodinger's dead child situation.
Yeah.
She thinks Persephone is dead, because why else would someone leave Mount Olympus? Why would anyone leave Mount Olympus? It's so great there. And, like, why would anybody want to leave dear mommy's side? Yeah, we don't see, like, specific scenes of Persephone's childhood, but if your mom is the kind of person who would commit mass murder in reaction to you leaving, they're probably not the best parent. I don't know. Maybe that's out of line. And it's interesting because, of course, Demeter is the person who made the choice to shack up with a human lover and have a half-mortal child.
But don't they all, though?
Well, they do all, but what happens to people with a level of mortality is that they die.
Turns out, yeah.
She knew that was a risk that she was taking. And so we even with her get a sense that her anger is, if she were to admit it, probably more at herself than it is with the concept of humanity.
Sure.
But because the stage of grief she's stuck in is anger, all she is doing is lashing out in the most extreme possible way.
Yeah.
Which is killing everyone who reminds her of her daughter even a little bit, because she believes her daughter is gone. And again, we see a person reacting in an unhealthy way because they are being denied information that might help them make a more rational decision. I think Demeter is probably always scary, but if she knew Zeus had just kind of kidnapped her daughter and spirited her away, she would have just tried to kill Zeus, which at least is like the correct target if you're gonna be angry at somebody.
As a person who's played through the original God of War trilogy, I can tell you it's pretty satisfying killing Zeus. So, yeah. I'm always gonna be pro kill the Pantheon.
Pro kill Zeus. And then, of course, that brings us to the person whose grief and anger this game is really about, which is Hades. As we've talked about, he is fully hiding behind this authoritarian role as the leader of the underworld to cover up everything that he's feeling. So I think he has the most sort of complicated set of feelings to work through, because he is trying to balance this, like, okay, so I do have to take care of this kid now. He is my kid. I have to take care of him, even though, like, I don't really like his personality very much. And he reminds me so much of this mother who left, and that's really hard for me. And also this, like, well, I told her I would protect her. I'm not going to sell her out to the Olympians who might try to hurt her. And also, I'm still really mad at her. And he has to
and
sort of...
also, I'm still in love with her. And really, like, I want to find her and I want to tell her things. Like, the dog is okay and, like, our son is alive. But I can't, because that's the one thing she told me she didn't want. And...
yeah.
I'm trying to be a good guy here.
Yeah. And on top of that, he does have to run the whole underworld, which is becoming an increasingly difficult undertaking as time goes on, because again, Demeter is killing people at an unprecedented rate.
Yeah.
So he's busy all the time.
Right. The paperwork alone.
The paperwork alone. You should really see it. The way that he mistreats Zagreus are so familiar, though. They don't make Hades feel like a bad dad in a way that, like, a god would be a bad father. This is just a bad dad the way that anybody might have a bad dad. You know, he's badgering Zagreus about being lazy. He's critiquing his work, but not letting him do work that's suited to his actual abilities. He refuses to let him leave the house. Most of the articles and essays I found about this game were writers saying something along the lines of either this game helped me understand my father better, or this game helped me understand my kids better, or this game helped me sort of realize and process the, you know, grief, anger, trauma, or whatever I feel regarding my parents. There are a lot of them, but I found a particularly resonant quote from an article called Hey Dad, Hades and Fatherhood by George Umbarger.
I'm going to say Umberger. I feel like, I don't know, Umbarger if you want to look it up, and we'll put it in the show notes, but it's pretty interesting.
My apologies, George.
Yeah, George, great stuff. Sorry about your dad.
So I'll have Spencer read that for me real quick.
So George writes, quote, I was finally finding my footing in Hades and working out consistently successful win strategies in early November of last year, which just so happened to line up with the first anniversary of my father's death. Let me tell you, even for as obvious an observation as it might seem, when you've had a complicated, antagonistic relationship with a male role model, the story of a young man struggling to break free from the grasp of condescending, vindictively aloof father resonates in ways you might not expect. The first time I successfully guided Zag to a showdown with Hades and their pre-familicidal verbal exchange started, the adrenal final boss chills were immediately snuffed by the kind of wide-eyed, cavernous pit in my stomach that can only come from a particularly traumatic strain of déjà vu. This is a conversation with my father, I thought. Now, my dad never lied to me about my parentage or threatened me with physical harm, but those are so far from the root of what makes Supergiant's take on the Lord of the Underworld as notably vile as he is, that they feel almost irrelevant. It's in the everyday injuries, the baseline of venomous sarcasm, the ever-present emotional bulwark of toxic masculinity, the absolute refusal to budge from archaic beliefs long enough to even consider honest self-reflection. And it's there where my monitor started feeling a little too close to a mirror in my recent past for my comfort.
So, fathers and sons, huh?
Yep.
Why, in your opinion, as a man, do fathers and sons seem to want to fight each other? Why is this such a theme in fiction going back to actual antiquity?
Sheesh. First thing I'll say is that there are just some actual bad dads out there.
Sure, absolutely.
So, let's just not discount the fact that there are just bad dads who don't want to be fathers or fully resent their children in some way. So if you have a bad dad, don't let us try and convince you that, you can spend 200 hours running through the same conversation loops with them to somehow make them better. You probably can't. They're just some bad dads.
There are some types of harm that nothing can or should excuse, explain, justify, and that you as a person should never have to put up with. That is not what we're saying.
Yeah. But I think from a literary perspective, if you sort of look at some of the meta-narratives about fathers and sons, some recurring themes come up. So, typically you can use fathers and sons to represent two different generational ideologies, sort of the way things used to work versus the new age school of thought. And so that leads father and sons to, combat one another because the son would like to make a mark in the world for himself and step out of the shadow of his father's either great success or horrible sins, right? Mm-hmm. They want to be identified as their own person, not someone that belongs to a family name or a family tree. That's a big one, but I think more in this game, what we see is kind of this other narrative that shows up, which is the father has the curse of experience, meaning every dad who cares even a little bit about their children wants to try and protect them from the biggest, scariest, most terrible, traumatic thing that has ever happened to that father. And I think that's what we're seeing in this game, which is you have big, strong, manly man Hades, who's, very career focused and takes his work very seriously. And he sure did make the mistake of falling in love and allowing himself to become vulnerable, only for that to truly bite him in the butt. Mm-hmm. And so he tries to fully shelter Zagreus and overprotect him. And when Zagreus starts to try and explore the world and escape the underworld for himself, Hades is the one who stands in his way and physically fights him to the death to prevent him from finding a worse pain elsewhere, which is something that Hades has never quite been able to figure out how to reconcile for himself. This idea of mental anguish, emotional pain that comes from becoming, vulnerable in a way that he's not accustomed to. And so those are the two that spring to mind for me. One of the big fallacies that dads have is I've seen the world, I've been through this, I know how it's going to turn out for you. Yeah. Which is wrong. Yeah, you can help try and protect them and give them knowledge and help your children become better prepared for the world, but you cannot predict how well or how poorly they're going to deal with even the exact same traumas that may have ruined your life and caused you to be in chains or whatever. Yeah. And for whatever reason, dads just have a hard time of transitioning into the role where they can just put trust and faith in their children and reach that state of acceptance that they are their own person and hope that they will be more successful than I was.
Yeah, and it's frustrating in Hades that so much of it manifests as him trying to convince Zagreus that he is not good at things, because that is clearly so driven by fear that Zagreus is going to get hurt, right? Hades kind of has the same thing a little bit that Thanatos does, but of course it manifests in a meaner way, which is, we noted before, he has this sort of obsession with talking about Zagreus's blood and how it looks like mortal blood. And anytime that you can see Zagreus's blood, it's because he has gotten hurt. Right. And while Thanatos reacts to that, but oh God, please stop getting hurt, stop it. Hades manifests as sort of disgust almost with stop bleeding all over the place. Right. Because he doesn't want to admit fundamentally that he is scared of Zagreus getting hurt. and what that means, and he's afraid that Zagreus is going to go out into the world and like ruin things. Like everything is so precarious, just stop touching it. Stop touching things, stop breaking things. You're like, this is a house of cards and you are a wrecking ball. It causes him to just sort of restrict Zagreus in every way that he possibly can, including like emotionally, and that he can't think of any way to communicate that fear except by saying, you're not good at anything. Stop trying to do things. You're not good at any of them. Just stay in the house and sit down and be quiet and stop bleeding all over the place. You're going to ruin everything, but not telling him what he's going to ruin. So from Zagreus' perspective, it's just like a relentless barrage of insults that he has no way of knowing are born out of fear and not out of just hatred.
Well, and that's the flip side of the coin, right? Where the father has seen horrible and wonderful things, the child is left in a state of curiosity because they haven't seen all that much. And they're filled with hope because how would they expect that there are such terrible things out there that could lay them low?
Yeah.
Like they don't know. And so there is always a butting of heads there that's almost unavoidable, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's just a matter of like, how do you deal with it when it happens? Don't fight each other to the death.
Yeah, that shouldn't be part of it.
Step one.
Yeah, and one of the most beautiful parts of the characterization of Zagreus is that he is just like so cheerfully curious about everything. And because he has so little life experience, he doesn't know what kind of questions he shouldn't ask people. He doesn't know what hurts people and what doesn't, because he has a father who is obsessed with never letting him get hurt. So he doesn't know that it's going to hurt Achilles' feelings if he's like, whoa, why does your dead ex-boyfriend not want to talk to you? That seems weird. I thought you guys were in love, and people who are in love should want to talk to each other. So what did you do, Achilles? And Achilles is like, oh, God. Zagreus basically has no sort of emotional immune system, sort of, because he's had such limited interactions with other people. And all of the people that he has interacted with in his whole life have worked for his father, who has set down specific guidelines about these are the topics we don't talk about in this house. And so Zagreus has no way of knowing how to talk to people in the sort of stilted, emotionally aware way that we all talk about grief. And so he's just like a bulldozer. Anytime he interacts with somebody, he's just like, well, why are you mad at your husband? Why would you lie to me? Why would anybody lie about anything? Why would anybody not talk through a problem? Because he has never encountered any of the problems that people don't want to talk about.
I may have already said this, but this is a way that I definitely identify with this character. And it's not because I was so sheltered. It's quite the opposite. Like, there were no topics that were off limits in my household. Like, I was very much raised in a...
boy.
I know, yeah.
Cannot relate.
I was going to say, I didn't want to, like, flip this as a question, but, yeah, it was like, we talked about everything, or, like, I always grew up with the idea that I could, that nothing was too sacred to ask questions about or be curious about. And it's tough, like, growing up in an environment like that, because then you, as a young adult, as you're meeting new people and encountering new situations, like, you realize that you can come on too strongly and you can ask questions that ultimately push people away, and they will not give you a second chance.
Yeah.
And I had to really figure out how to become a little bit more socially nuanced, similarly to Zagreus. But it came out of a totally different place of like, well, why wouldn't you talk about this horrible tragedy? Why wouldn't you question this like ideology that dictates your world? Why wouldn't you ask about these like taboo subjects that everyone wants to know about, but everyone's too afraid to talk about? Like, let's talk about it. Come on, tell me about it.
Yeah.
Hello, stranger. Tell me about your deepest, darkest fantasies and secrets.
Yeah. That's where Zagreus sort of starts the game. And as he encounters more and more people who are like keeping secrets and only giving him bits and pieces of information at a time, and he sort of recognizes that there are these walls up that he's going to have to figure out how to navigate around, we see him get a little bit more savvy, especially when he's talking to his father. We talked earlier about the first time that you kill Hades, and he says that thing about go tell your mother that Cerberus is doing well.
Yeah.
We didn't say what Zagreus' reaction to that is, which is, I'll think about it if you tell me something first. Because by the time you get to kill Hades, you've run through this a lot of times.
Right.
And he's been beating his head against this wall a lot of times. And so he's like, okay, we're going to bargain now, Dad. And he says, tell me, why did Mother leave?
Ooh.
And what is Hades' reaction?
Blurg.
He dies. He just dies instead of answering the question.
Freaking the biggest dad move in the whole game, right? Like, Dad, I've been wondering something my whole life, and I've only just now developed the courage and found the opportunity to ask you. What's the meaning? Oh, hey, no!
Get back here, Dad!
You bastard!
And then you do go and interact with Persephone for the first time, and then when you wash back up in the house of Hades, Hades is sitting there at his desk, and you walk up to him and you're like, I found her, and I can talk to her now, and now I'm going to find all the answers. What do you think about that, Dad? And he's like, you didn't kill me.
He just gaslights you.
He's like, oh, sorry, you think I wouldn't remember if you fought me to the death and I died? That's ridiculous, boy. I would remember if that had happened, and it definitely didn't.
This has for sure happened in my life, but it wasn't like a death battle. It was like a game of basketball or something where like whatever the first time I beat my dad in chess or something, like he was just like, no, that couldn't happen. Boy. You know, it's like, what?
Yeah,
he must have dreamed it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's both a very funny moment in game and like so deeply horrifying that it's like you won't even give him that. You won't even recognize when he did actually finally best you. Yeah. And there are witnesses, like now Persephone knows. We can verify that this has happened, and he's still like, nope, didn't happen.
Nope. Not my boy.
There is a point eventually where, you do this loop a million times, and this is the sort of sign that the end game is coming, is you get up to the surface, and Hades is like, just go. That's after you found out all of his secrets. It is only when the air has been completely cleared with Hades, and you've learned everything that you're going to learn, and all that's left to do is encourage Persephone to come back to the underworld and fix her problems herself, that Hades is finally like, okay. Go on. And then after that, he gives you a job trying to fight your way out of the underworld. And so he starts fighting you again because that's part of the security protocol. But I don't think Zagreus is a vindictive sort of person. Again, he's fundamentally kind. You see that in all of his interactions with pretty much all of the NPCs. The most like mean-spirited thing he does is try to convince Orpheus that he and Dionysus are the same person. And then immediately, as soon as Orpheus writes this heroic song about them, he's like, oh no, no, we were kidding. Oh no.
Yeah, I mean, like his superpower is fast foot, right? And like, he is a quick thinker, and like, I think all of his characteristics point to a need to go and explore, and like, yeah, he'll like do what he has to if someone's standing in his way. Yeah. But his goal is always to get out and to see and to learn and to talk. The fights are just sort of in the way, even if it's his dad. Yeah. Or his ex-girlfriend. Or the bone hydra.
Well, and speaking of, like, Thanatos and Megara, he, like, again, becomes aware over time, even as he is like, I am doing this for a good reason and I'm going to keep doing it. He does at a certain point recognize, like, oh, this is hard for you guys, isn't it? He will, as the game progresses, become aware of how other people have complicated feelings that maybe he doesn't fully understand. There's particularly cute interactions with, like, Dusa, for example, which, again, I'm not going to spoil because I think you should play the game, where it's like, if you tell this man, no, stop, he will stop. He doesn't understand a lot of the social cues the first time around, but if you tell him that he is doing something harmful, he will stop. It's just that when it comes to his father, there is a part of him that kind of wants the catharsis a little bit, even as he recognizes that it's sort of stupid. And it's just kind of a waste of effort on both of their parts, because he's like, the way that we solve this problem is you talk to me. And if you're not going to talk to me and you want to try to hit me with your big fork, then fine. But this doesn't have to be a conflict, Dad. You could just talk to me. A big part of Hades' suite of superpowers, and what he, in fact, once you reconcile with him, gives the player character the ability to do, is disappear.
I forget about that. That's from the actual, like, mythology of Hades had this cloak where he could become invisible.
Yeah.
And you see that in the fight as well. Yeah. Which is like perfectly aligned with his trauma of like hiding out in the underworld, becoming, walled off by his grief and consumed by his work. He also can become physically invisible, which is like wild.
Well, and it's interesting to kind of juxtapose that against a figure like Thanatos, who his ability is when he gets uncomfortable with a conversation, he teleports. Whereas Hades, when he gets uncomfortable, disappears, but is still there.
He hides.
Yeah. Right.
He's worked so hard to develop the classical masculine identity of strength. But then when things confront him that he doesn't quite know how to deal with, he hides, he retreats because he doesn't ever want to be seen as vulnerable. It's really sad.
Yeah. Hades is a sad figure.
Sad dad.
Yeah. So I found a, apologies in advance, somewhat long quote from an essay by Jessica Howard titled Hades, an Ode to Family Trauma, that I feel like kind of sums up the nuances of this situation from Zagreus' point of view.
Hades is a game all about the struggle to break free from familial trauma. It's a game about escape, futility, resentment, and coexistence. Each time Zagreus exits his chambers and enters Tartarus, he strives to get farther away from not only his father's abuse and ideologies, but the person he is told he is and should be. To Zagreus, the promise of growing closer to some sense of validation and understanding is greater than the agony of both his father's grip on him and death. So he chooses it, again and again and again. This repeated trial and error is an exhausting, yet cathartic process, a form of therapy perhaps, and as he works through the underworld and his own thoughts, his perceptions of his father, family, and self change, and not always in the most expected ways. The further he progresses, the less angry and begrudging he becomes. The more he learns, the more he understands the motivations and nuances of his father and various family members. For all his father's aggression, obstinacy, and vengeance, there is pain and caring. Pain he should resolve, of course, but pain all the same. His family of gods, while helpful, can be jealous, vengeful, and absolute messes. He discovers that while his father, Hades, took it too far to keep him apart from them, this choice was made in an attempt to protect Zagreus from the people who hurt him, including Zagreus' mother, Persephone. I think what makes Hades so compelling and resonant for me, however, is the strange purgatory of coexistence Zagreus exists in. His relationships with his family cycle between playful and antagonistic, critical and cheeky. There are points in which Zagreus truly hates his father, and for good reason. But he remains open to the conversation and bound to him in the way that children inevitably are to their parents. For many of us, including Zagreus, it's not so simple to let go and, quote, cut out toxic people, even if we're given permission to do so. How can we when we understand them, when all we know is them, when we are a part of them? By the time the game, quote unquote, ends, Zagreus has reached a place not of complete forgiveness, but enough has changed to where there is some semblance of acceptance, some semblance of peace, and he is no longer escaping. He has broken free of the ideology inadvertently bestowed upon him by Hades, one of aggression, obstinance, and evasion. He is acting with purpose and tolerance and has found his own place in the house of Hades, in spite of his trauma and relationships.
Yeah, I think that bit at the end is one of the things that makes this game most valuable when it comes to like giving people a model of what to do if they are in a similar situation, because the obvious advice is just like, well, just don't talk to that person anymore.
Yeah, which is stupid.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are definitely situations where the best and healthiest solution is to not interact with a person anymore. There are still times when I think that is useful advice. Yeah,
I should unpack what I said. As someone who has, quote unquote, tried to cut out toxic people, it's not always an option, actually. Like, I went through a period where I didn't talk to my parents at all for a really long time. And what I was hoping for was some kind of dialogue that they initiated so that we could actually get to the heart of the issues, as it were. But what ended up happening is we just existed in this bubble of silence for a long time. And the thing is, life keeps happening in that bubble. If you're not talking to people, that doesn't mean that like other family members aren't dying or that like major life changes aren't happening. It's just that you're not there to be a part of it, and it becomes harder and harder to come back. It's complicated, and it's not something that works like a video game or a rom-com. Humans are complex. Human relationships are tough to navigate. And try as we might, as much as we might desire this fantasy of just hitting the reset button or moving to a new country and just like be assuming a new identity, like that doesn't mean that those people don't still exist and aren't like doing stuff in the world that ultimately you are connected to. And that's the tough part.
Even if you do leave, that's not the end of the work. If you have had a traumatic enough experience with someone, even if you never see that person again, that's going to stick with you, and you're going to have to do something. The screen that comes up in this game every time you die says there is no escape. Oof. Because there isn't. Even if Zagreus were to leave forever and never talk to Hades again, he still had a whole childhood with that man.
And he's still his father. Like, Zagreus, Hades is still his father.
Dad.
Persephone is still his mom. No matter where he goes, that lineage is always a part of him. There is no escape.
Yeah, well, and we see that in Hades. Hades had a very traumatic relationship with his own father.
And brothers.
And brothers.
And just the whole damn family, really.
They kill Kronos.
Yeah.
As far as he knows, his father is dead.
Right.
He is still deeply, deeply hurt by all of the things that his father did to him. There's a reason that so many people get stuck at anger or leave anger briefly and come back to anger. And it's because it's really frustrating to have to live with something that you want so desperately to put behind you and you can't.
Anger is usually born of this like struggle against futility. Like having to reconcile or like accept the fact that there are just certain things beyond your control is really, it pisses me off so much. Like, let me just do the thing. Let me just move the God.
Yeah. I just want to be okay and normal and well-adjusted. What buttons do I have to push to make that happen?
The cheat codes.
Yeah, so I have collected, I'll put them into the description, some different resources put out by the Hospice Foundation of America and Harvard Health about, what to do if you or someone you know is kind of in a place of grief that is manifesting in anger and that is like harming the relationships with the people around them. Because there is this kind of drive sometimes, I'm sure you've seen it, I have definitely seen it, of people who would benefit greatly from connection, who are doing everything in their power to hurt everyone who loves them so much that they don't want to talk to them anymore.
Yeah. I've like been that person.
Oh,
before.
sure. Yeah.
Thanks for agreeing so readily to that.
In fact, this is an intervention.
Spencer,
you got me. I really hate it when every time I try to talk to you, you try to stab me with a giant fork. I wish you wouldn't do that anymore.
Sometimes I use magic.
And then you disappear.
Yeah.
What you gotta do is find an outlet for the feeling. So in the context of this game, the outlet that like Zagreus chooses is like, just talk to me. If we have a conversation about what you're upset about, you might stop being upset about it so much, right? Like, this is why people go to therapy. If you don't know what happens in therapy, you go into a room and you say out loud the thing that's bothering you, and sometimes even just that helps.
Actually, I was going to circle back to, I mentioned not talking to my parents. The thing that I did to announce what was bothering me is I wrote them a letter. And really common therapeutic advice is to write letters that you don't even need to send. It's just like really powerful to get your ideas and your like hurt feelings out on a piece of paper. Or if you're like really angry, you can write the angriest letter you've ever written and never send it. Again, as an outlet. But truthfully, like if you can share those feelings, even with a neutral third party like a therapist, and vocalize them, that's huge. Or if you find a way where you can actually communicate them to the people that you have a problem with, that really was the thing that helped mine and my parents' relationship the most, is just like me making it explicitly known that I was hurting, here are the things that I thought, and what I was clinging to was this idea that I needed them to do the same thing. I didn't.
Yeah.
Like, our relationship has fundamentally changed because I was honest about what I was feeling. I gave it time and space. They respected that time and space. And now we have more of an adult relationship. It wasn't the best way. I wish it didn't have to go that way. I would have liked it to happen more immediately, but that, again, is not how human relationships work.
Yeah.
So
if you are a person who has someone in your life who is a Hades type figure, I think having sort of the two-step approach of finding a sort of healthy way to express how you're feeling to that person, and then also accepting that their reaction is going to be what their reaction is.
Mm-hmm.
And that is obviously the kind of stuff that therapy could really help with. But the writing a letter thing, I think, is such good advice, because often in the moment, in person, it can be really hard to articulate yourself properly and say something hurtful that you don't mean, or not properly. Yeah. Well,
like,
yeah. Do they?
Yeah.
So like finding a moment when the emotions are maybe not running quite as high, or writing something down so you can just get all of your thoughts out and give it to the other person to read at a time when they feel able to do that, and then accepting, as you must, that maybe that will lead to something healthier, but maybe it won't, but it will help you kind of let go of some of the hurt feelings that you're having, and help you decide if you need to set up other boundaries, if you need to say like, okay, well, I'll see you guys at Christmas, and that will be the time that I see you, and we're not going to talk about X, Y, and Z, or maybe I don't talk to this person anymore. Like, you can't know what boundaries are going to be most appropriate until you start trying to address the problem.
Yeah.
A conversation won't happen unless somebody starts it. From the other perspective, if one of the problems, why grief manifests as anger for so many people, and not just men, to be clear, we talk about men here, but like this is a problem that lots of people have, is just that occasionally grief is blindsiding. You know, it comes out of nowhere by definition. And a lot of people don't think about how they're going to deal with things before they happen. And particularly like because anger is something that comes on suddenly, and if you're in sort of the heat of it, is very hard to control sometimes, it can be helpful to think ahead of time what anger looks like for you and what it could cost you if you were to, you know, express it in such a way that might drive someone away. In this game, the end goal, if there weren't this sort of magical underworld stuff, is that Zagreus leaves and doesn't come back. I think that is his intention at the beginning of the game, is to leave and not come back, because he doesn't know at the beginning that he can't actually leave the underworld. And that is frequently the cost. So I read a book that I really recommend in general called Beyond Anger by Thomas Harbin. One of the things that he recommends in that book for anybody who kind of struggles with anger and like doesn't understand why their relationships seem to be falling apart, it can be good to have kind of an objective metric to look at. So there's something called the Novico Provocation Inventory, which is, yeah, we're in therapy speak now, friends.
Destiny, original, Deadfire, Sin, Purgatory,
Divinity,
7.
Original Sin 2. This inventory is just a list of 80 different scenarios. Respondents are asked to rate the degree to which the incident described by the item would anger or provoke them on a 5-point scale. So they're things that range in severity, right? So like being overpriced, or
5.
overcharged for something by a repairman,
5.
being called a liar,
7.
being you're not doing it right.
I'm so mad.
Being singled out in a group for a correction, getting your car stuck in the snow, getting stranded in an airport, your kid getting a bad grade in school, like things that are sort of different levels of anger, and you rate each of them, and then you have a number at the end when you add them all together, and it sort of tells you how easily provoked you are. And he says in the book that like sometimes, especially for men, it is very helpful to have a number that says like, this is the scale of anger, you're at the high end. Most people are down here, you're up here. And especially if you are sort of doing this in preparation for events to come, you can kind of understand that that is a tendency that you have. And once you understand that it's a tendency you have, in the moment when you're getting angry, you can be like, okay, I'm getting angry. Okay, let's think about if this is a purely emotional thing or if there is something here that I need to act on. And like, then you can remove yourself from the situation and so on and so forth. For parents and kids, the way to keep these sort of altercations from happening is to ensure that the space for conversation exists. And it doesn't have to be when you are in the middle of an emotionally charged situation.
Probably shouldn't be.
It probably shouldn't be. You need to know if the person you're talking to wants to walk away for a while and if they're not going to be able to do anything productive in the moment. That can be very hard to do. But if you want to avoid a situation where someone just leaves and doesn't talk to you anymore, you have to be willing to have hard conversations, which sucks. I wish that wasn't the advice I had to give you. Yeah. But if you want to have a human relationship with another person, you got to do the hard parts. It can't just be the good stuff all the time.
That's life, baby.
That's life, baby. All right. So I will add one more quote from the first article that we quoted from, where the author is talking about the parallels between the game and the circumstances surrounding his own father's death.
George says, "My next several runs of the game doubled as many therapy sessions. Given the sheer number of parallels, I started out by projecting myself more onto Zagreus in hopes of finding a new angle to process my freshly resurfaced snarl of emotions. But it was ultimately the structure of the game itself that shone a light on my predicament. Set out, assemble resources, concoct strategy, test abilities, deal with father, return to baseline, set out again with more experience. This is the roguelike gameplay loop. This is the grieving process. Grief may be an indelible mark on the self, but no more than any other event in your life, positive or negative. No different from a failed run at escaping the underworld, even painful events yield useful experience to channel into self-improvement. The experience is only a loss if you fail to learn from it." Wow, thanks, George.
Thanks, George.
That's true, though. I mean, like, I'm a firm believer that you're the one ultimately that's responsible for making meaning of your entire life, good, bad, ugly. And yeah, I mean, if you want to stay walled off from the things that can hurt you, instead of dealing with them, to try and reach a new plateau, whether it be just a new stage of grief or ultimately some escape from that cycle, some kind of hope for a new existence, then yeah, so be it. I mean, but ultimately, I once you're in a place where you're ready to accept something new, then yeah, your goal is to try and learn from it and move forward.
Yeah, and make peace with the fact that occasionally you're going to get knocked all the way back to the beginning.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. It's a process. There
and back again.
Thus endlessly we beat our bows into the choppy waters of the...
Oh, wow. That you were so close.
No, I wasn't. Ceaselessly into the night, born again, blessed and...
Yeah, we're...
What is it?
So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
God damn. It's such a good line.
I know.
Like, it's a good book. Damn it.
The thing about The Great Gatsby is it's a really good book. So that's our recommendation. Read The Great Gatsby.
That's it. That's all, folks.
No. Okay, so real quick. On a scale of 1 to 10, how highly would you recommend Hades, and to whom?
I might have to give this a pass because I haven't played the game like you have. I mean, I've talked to you a lot about it. On a narrative level, I think it checks a lot of boxes because you're playing with Greek mythology, so it's a huge well of excellent narratives to pull from, wonderful characters. The themes that we talked about are extremely important in a way that you can find in a variety of other media, but there's something to playing through this on the loop that a roguelike provides, which I think is really important that this was our first video game that we talked about, because it does something different in terms of genre than other sort of finite media can do. So I'm going to give it a high rating, but I'm going to let the score come from you just because you've played it for hours and hours and hours. Like, you know what the experience is like. I can only really comment on the narrative that I think, from my perspective, really has no flaws. Like, I think it's an excellent story, and more than that, it's an excellent way to enact the story, not just have it be told to you.
Yeah, I mean, speaking earlier about the sort of embodied learning that the Greeks loved so much, you're in the gymnasium, you're learning philosophy, you're doing both at once. Obviously, this is a video game is not necessarily physical exercise in the same way, but it is a visceral experience. There's a reason that so many of these articles hit on, like, I experienced something in relation to my own life, because in order for a video game to progress, you, the player, have to pilot it. It is not like a movie where it can just kind of go and you can stop paying attention to it and it's going to keep progressing, regardless of whether you're engaging with it. If you want Zagreus to fix anything, you have to make him do it.
Right.
And so you are participating in the process. Listen, the gamers will tell you it's a good game. It is a fun experience. It's not a punishing sort of game to play. It's not one that has a really high barrier to entry. It wants to be accessible to people. And I think it's a good game if you don't necessarily have the kind of experience with grief and anger and these complicated familial relationships. I think it's a phenomenal game if you do. I will stick to the rating system.
Okay. You just want to grade it based on just story then?
I'm going to say story-wise, I think it is 9 out of 10.
Yeah.
Because of the caveats we talked about before, because it does have this weird hang up with like particular body types, and it does have the baggage that all Western media has. But I think the story of the relationship between a father and son and grief and loss and all of the complexities there would make it a 10 out of 10 if it didn't have that video game problem of only having thin, hot people.
Well, that plus like just the depth of side characters that aren't just like unlock gamer achievement by doing X, Y quest. Like they also have their own stories that are so deep and narratively rich that...
All right, 9.5 for Skelly. Is a 9.5.
Anyway, we're pretty high on this game. Kelcee from a player perspective, me from a story perspective exclusively. There are some of our listeners who are never going to go play this thing.
Yes.
Is there an accessible way for them to just like watch it?
I mean, there are like recap videos on YouTube and stuff.
We didn't find any like really clean ones though, did we?
Yeah, the thing about a video... Let
me teach you. So a video.
Definitively.
The thing about a video.
The thing about a video game is that it is meant to be played.
Right.
And what I can say about this one is that they try to make it as accessible as possible. But if you are not a person who plays video games, that's going to make it hard for you to relate to this story because by definition, it is meant to be played and not watched. So that'll be a restriction in terms of who this connects with.
That's okay.
By definition.
Because like we've talked already about different genres of film. Like, you know, we've talked about or will talk about horror. And there are just some people that will never watch a horror movie because that's just not for them. There are some people who think they're too old to go watch a goofy movie because it's a cartoon or whatever. And that's fine. Like, if it's not for you, it's not for you. Know that. That's okay. That's what our podcast is here to do, you know, is to fill in the gaps that you might be interested in.
One of the things that makes this such a powerful piece of media is because it exists in the landscape of video games where every hand-wringing person who's ever been to Congress will tell you, oh, there's a lot of bad stuff in video games, which is incredibly reductive. There's a lot of good stuff in video games too. But I can imagine for a person who went into this game expecting, okay, I'm going to get a sword and I'm going to hack some stuff up and that'll be the game, they got a much, much richer experience than they bargained for. And that's why it was made, to appeal to a group of people who needed that and weren't getting it.
Yeah. So it occurs to me this might be a long episode. Do you think it's a super giant episode?
Oh my God. We are absolutely open to doing a super giant sponsorship deal. I will shill your stuff forever.
We got anything else?
No, I think that's it.
Cool. I'm getting sweaty over here.
I'm getting sweaty too.
I'm ready to go play another roguelike.
Yeah.
We've got a cult to follow.
Yeah, join us next time as we talk about Cult of the Lamb, a game that you should not emulate under any circumstances.
Please don't. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you as always for joining us on this new adventure of ours talking about video games. If there are any other video games that you think would work well for us, let us know. I've got a Steam account and I love a video game. So let me know. But until next time, join us again.
Until next time, stay safe out there, boys.
Stay safe out there, boys. And join us next time for more compassionate conversations about masculinity in media. Bye. There is no mistake.